President's Life Portrait Series, we feature President Herbert Hoover. This program is about 2.5 hours.
I prefer to think of Iowa as I saw it through the eyes of a 10-year-old boy. Those were eyes filled with the wonders of Iowa's streams and woods. They saw days filled with adventure, with participation in good and comforting things.
Herbert Hoover carried fond memories of his Iowa childhood until the end of his 90 years. But all was not idyllic for the young future president, who was orphaned at age 9, and a year later sent to live with a Quaker uncle in Oregon. It was there that his already formidable self-reliance developed into a salient trait that would one day characterize his term in office.
My boyhood ambition was to be able to earn my own living without the help of anybody, anywhere.
As a young adult, Hoover made extra money working in the onion fields near his home in Salem, Oregon. He attended business school at age 14, and 3 years later became the youngest member of Stanford University's pioneer class of 1891. At Stanford, he developed two interests, engineering and fellow geology student Lou Henry, whose natural intelligence and appetite for adventure matched his own. They married in 1899 and would have 2 boys. Hoover gave his wife plenty of adventure. They were still in their 20s when his career as a mining engineer took them around the world, to China during the Boxer Rebellion, to the gold mines of Australia, and to Burma, where a silver mine made him rich. By age 27, Hoover ranked as the highest paid man of his age in the world. Public service followed. During the First World War, Hoover helped raise billions of dollars to aid starving Europeans. He was named U.S. Food Administrator in 1917, and that same year joined President Wilson's War Trade Council. Such activities earned the shy and soft-spoken Hoover no small measure of celebrity. He was known as the Great Humanitarian and was soon singled out as a potential political candidate. In 1920, an assistant Navy secretary named Franklin Roosevelt remarked,
"He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him president. There couldn't be a better one."
Warren Harding made him his Commerce Secretary instead, a post Hoover filled for 7 years before winning the Republican presidential nomination in 1928. His acceptance speech conveyed high hopes for the country's future.
We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land.
The vision did not play itself out. 7 months after he and running mate Charles Curtis took office in 1929, the stock market crashed, losing billions of dollars in a single day. A prolonged drought followed, drying up the American plains and bankrupting countless farm families. The subsequent collapse of the nation's economy degenerated into a national depression. Hoover worked 18-hour days and spent millions on public work projects to alleviate the situation. He declined, however, to issue relief funds to individuals, a decision that stemmed largely from his sense that direct aid would foster excessive dependence on the federal government. Such a policy infuriated many Americans, who eventually turned their anger on the president. The nation's homeless began calling their makeshift shanty towns Hoovervilles, their newspapers Hoover blankets, and their knapsacks Hoover bags. His public persona didn't help matters. Uncomfortable speaking before crowds, Hoover usually appeared stiff and awkward, and his remarks to the nation typically generated little confidence. And though he did eventually move to provide limited federal relief to the unemployed, the public regarded the effort as too little, too late, and voted him out of office after a single term, choosing instead Hoover's old admirer, Franklin Roosevelt. In retirement, Hoover indulged his love for fishing and mystery novels, but also remained a highly active public servant. In the 1940s, he again raised funds for starving European children and later chaired 2 national commissions aimed at streamlining government. He also helped found UNICEF, served as honorary chairman of the Boys Clubs of America, and wrote more than 40 books. He died at age 90 in 1964, after the longest ex-presidency in American history.
Friends of many years, when the members of the Congress created these presidential libraries, They did a great public service. They made available for research the records of vital periods in American history. And they planted these records in the countryside instead of allowing their concentration on the seaboard. Already the three libraries of President Roosevelt, President Truman, and President Eisenhower, by their unique documentation, are today, they serve this purpose. And today we now dedicate the fourth, my own.
That was August 10th, 1962, Herbert Hoover's 88th birthday, when the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum opened here in West Branch, Iowa. A community of about 1,800 people. Today, the facility continues to be open to the public, and we are here as we continue C-SPAN's American President series, looking at the life and times of our 31st president, Herbert Hoover. West Branch is about a 2-hour drive from Des Moines and 4 hours along I-80 from Chicago. We're inside a replica of Suite 31A of the Waldorf Astoria, where Herbert Hoover spent most of his ex-presidency in New York City. And we're joined by Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian. Thanks for being with us on this October day.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
Is this room and the library a true representation of who Herbert Hoover was?
Well, I suppose we'll leave that to the visitor in some ways to decide. Certainly this room is, in fact, an authentic reproduction with original furnishings from the living room in Suite 31A. It was a 4-room suite that Hoover used as his base of operations for most of his ex-presidency, which, as you've heard, in fact, is the longest, arguably the most productive, and to some degree the most controversial in American history. Over my shoulder, you can see the desk. He did write over 40 books. Like many old men, he had trouble sleeping. He'd get up in the middle of the night and take great sheaves of letters from children. And he loved to answer letters from kids. In fact, he published a volume of those not long before his death. A friend of his who was staying with him one night in the 1950s noticed the light was on under the door. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. And he tapped on the door and he walked in and said, "Mr. Hoover, what are you doing?" And Hoover looked up from his desk. He said, "I'm just making my Roosevelt book more pungent." That's a book called Freedom Betrayed. It's never been published. It sits in the vaults here at the Hoover Library.
Why wasn't it published?
Well, it went through many, many drafts, many forms. It really was a history of U.S.-Soviet relations since Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. And he completed it the year before he died, completed it the fall of '63. I think the feeling at that point was, you know, he's almost 90 years old. He had led this extraordinarily controversial roller coaster of a life. He had regained the esteem of the American people. Why court fresh controversy by publishing the book at that time? So it's never seen the light of day. Hopefully someday it will.
You wrote in a book that came out when? An Uncommon Man, The Triumph of Herbert Hoover.
It was published in 1984. Hoover used to talk about the uncommon man. He said, in my view, there's been entirely too much talk about the century of the common man. He says, if you go to an American father or mother and call their children common, you'll hear just how upset they are. When we go into the hospital, we want an uncommonly good doctor. When we go to war, we want an uncommonly skillful admiral or general. The great advances in human society are caused by uncommon people.
There's a lot in this book, and I'm going to refer to it during the course of the next 2.5 hours. But early on in the book, the chapter is called Old Man in a Hurry. Yeah. You point out that Herbert Hoover never lost his appetite for a strenuous life. In his 85th year, he traveled 14,000 miles and delivered 20 speeches.
That's right.
At the age of 85.
At the age of 85. There's a marvelous story just before his 90th birthday, right about the time of his 90th birthday. He was watching this TV set. This is in fact a 1964 color TV, the height of innovation in 1964. And Hoover had one in his suite, was delighted with it. And it was, he had a friend's wife, and he asked her out of the blue, "What do you want out of life?" And she said, "You know, I'm very happy. I'm very happily married. I love my husband. I love my children. To be quite honest with you, I'm very happy with what I have." And Hoover sort of looked at her in horror and said, "How can you say that?" He said, "I want more. I want more friends. I want to write better books. I just want more." And that's Hoover, at the end of his life, still wanting more, wanting it all.
We'll get to that. We'll get to the beginning of his life in just a moment. We are about 2/3 of the way through our American President series here on C-SPAN as we devote the next 2.5 hours from West Branch, Iowa, looking at the life of Herbert Hoover. And as always, we welcome your participation. 202-624-1111 for those of you who live in the eastern half of the country. 202-624-1115 for those of you out west. And we'll also give you a good perspective of this library and museum, which was opened in 1962.
Yeah, in fact, Harry Truman, Mr. Hoover's unlikely but very close friend, came here to return the favor. In 1957, Hoover actually began the custom of having former presidents gather to dedicate one another's libraries when he went to Independence, Missouri, and helped Mr. Truman dedicate his library, along with Eleanor Roosevelt. Earl Warren gave the main speech that day. So 5 years later, Mr. Truman came here and helped his friend. They walked through this. In those days, it was a tiny little building. It was about 5,000 square feet. And Truman said, this library would fit in the basement of mine. And it's grown over the years, but it's still a very modest building. And people who come to West Branch, which is a lovely little town of about 1,800 people, invariably go away impressed with the simplicity, the kind of pastoral nature of this whole site.
In fact, we're looking at some scenes courtesy of WOI-TV, one of the television affiliates here in Iowa. Why, 30 years after he left the White House, did he finally establish a library?
Well, it's a good question. He had, of course, created the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace, which was an outgrowth of what he called Operation Pack Rat in World War I. When he began, he donated $50,000 to Stanford, and then in his travels, various relief efforts, he collected all kinds of papers arising out of the war, even collected Mata Hari's trunk, and that was the origin of the Hoover Institution. And then, of course, all of his presidential and personal papers wound up there. He became disenchanted with what he thought was the left-wing tilt of the Stanford faculty, and in fact, a lot of Stanford faculty members were unhappy with the Hoover Institution for its outspoken opposition to communism. And so in the late 50s, he decided that he would remove his presidential and personal papers and that there would be a library built here next to his birthplace. He had also decided at that point that he would be buried here on what's called the Overlook. And that's how the site came to be.
We'll take a call from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Go ahead, you're on C-SPAN. Hello, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. We'll try Aberdeen, South Dakota. Good morning.
Excuse me, let me turn down the TV.
Go ahead, please.
All right. I shouldn't start out with controversy, but I think this should be brought up. As you probably know, 1928 was the most virulent presidential election campaign in history, largely because of the Catholicism of Al Smith as opposed to the Protestantism of Herbert Hoover. Now, what many people do not realize is that Mr. Hoover's campaign manager was also a New York Irish Catholic named William J. Donovan. And the story on this is that Hoover had promised General Donovan to be the either Secretary of War or Secretary of, or the Attorney General, I'm sorry. Well, the rumors for a long time were that because of unabashed opposition among many Protestants in this country, such as leading church figures in Washington, D.C., Hoover did not formally offer the Attorney Generalship to Mr. Donovan. Instead, he offered him the Governor Generalship of the Philippines. Now, to be fair about this, in a book called Donovan and the CIA, which is a rewrite of an official history for CIA agencies that came out in 1975 and was classified, this is a popular version which was declassified and published in 1981. The author, Thomas F. Troy, says in his preface, "They're consequently a matter which needs updating as a result of additional research or recent developments. The first is the unexpected decision of President Hoover in 1929 not to appoint the then Colonel Donovan as Attorney General in the new administration. The text says that the reason had, quote, something to do with Donovan as a Catholic, unquote."
I'm going to stop you there, caller. Thanks very much. Richard Norton-Smith, familiar with this story?
Well, yeah, I've heard the story. Truth is, Hoover didn't much care for Wild Bill Donovan. It had nothing to do with his religion. On several occasions in the 28 campaign, there was indeed virulent anti-Catholicism expressed by some Republicans. Hoover publicly disowned them. And in fact, he went further. He said, as a Quaker, my ancestors have experienced religious persecution. I know something about it. I detest it. I disown anyone who would use it. And there was, in fact, scurrility on both sides. One of the really low points of the campaign came in the South. In fact, Governor Smith was losing the solid South, a lot of Democratic rural support because of his religion. There's no doubt about that. And perhaps Democrats who were driven to distraction by that fact cooked up a doctored photograph of Hoover dancing with a black woman. He, of course, had been very active in Mississippi flood relief and had spent some time in the South and had shaken hands with blacks and had socially interacted with blacks. And again, being a Quaker, was strongly opposed to racial discrimination. And so that sort of thing was used on the Democratic side. Didn't work. Hoover actually won 5 southern states, not Mississippi, but Texas and Florida and Virginia, among others. So it was not an elevating campaign. The surprising thing about the 28 campaign is how much both candidates agreed on. And one reason why you got all these side issues was because they basically were in agreement on most fundamental questions.
Our conversation is with Richard Norton Smith, who is the author of how many books?
9.
And has headed up the Hoover Library from 1987 until 1993.
That's right.
Worked at the Eisenhower Center, the Reagan Library, and now executive director of the Ford Library. Is that some sort of a record?
Gosh, I don't know. Maybe I just can't keep a job.
We're going to give you a tour of the grounds in just a moment to really give you a perspective of where we're at in West Branch and the grounds that surround the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. But first, a call from Houston, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to know the hours and the dates when the library's open. I'd like to go see it. If you can give that to me sometime in this cast, I sure appreciate it.
I can tell you right now, it's open year-round except Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, and the hours are, what, 9 to 5?
9 to 5, 7 days a week.
7 days a week? Okay.
Yes.
Now, my question here is this, if you can help me out here, is in 1920, Hoover, was he officially a candidate for president or an unofficial candidate for president? Because I noticed he was, the other two candidates were Leonard Wood and Frank Loden of Illinois, and it seemed like I've read where Hoover came in third in this Republican quest for the nomination. And my question is, was he an active candidate or an inactive candidate for presidency in the 1920s?
That's a very good question. In fact, in 1920, both parties were interested in nominating Hoover. Franklin Roosevelt, who in those days was a good friend of Hoover's and a Washington neighbor, said that he wished that the Democrats would nominate Hoover. As he said, there couldn't be a better president. Of course, at this point, Hoover was the humanitarian with the heroic World War I record. In fact, however, Hoover made it known that he was a progressive Republican. He had supported Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign in 1912. He did allow his name to be placed on the ballot in the California primary against Hiram Johnson, that state senator. He didn't like Johnson. Johnson was an isolationist. Hoover opposed Johnson's views, and in the end, although he did not win the California primary, he received enough votes to fatally damage Johnson's campaign for the nomination. So in fact, Johnson came in third at that Republican convention behind Wood and Loudon, and of course, eventually, the senatorial cabal got together and nominated Warren Harding, who in the end put Hoover in his cabinet.
We are right off Interstate 80, the signs marking the Herbert Hoover Library, and we're coming to you from inside a replica of Suite 31A of the Waldorf Astoria, where he spent most of his last 30 or 40 years of his post-presidential years. And on the grounds, just a short walk, is the presidential birthplace of Herbert Hoover. And we're joined by Dan Banta, who is the Chief Ranger of the Hoover National Historic Site. Good morning. Thanks very much for being with us.
Morning, Steve.
When was Herbert Hoover born and where?
Well, Herbert Hoover was born right in this little cottage behind me on August 10th of 1874. And as you can see from outside, it's not a very large building. We're going to step inside in just a few minutes and take a look and get a better appreciation for that site.
And it was Downey Street, is that correct?
Right at the corner of Penn and Downey Street in West Branch, yes.
How many rooms inside the cottage?
There are just 2 rooms. The cottage is a total of about 14 by 20, so less than 300 square feet, and 1 large living area and then a bedroom, which is where Herbert was actually born. We're stepping inside now, and you can get a better appreciation as we're in these tight quarters. This was the family home of the Hoovers for about 8.5 years or so, and it was built again in 1871, and they lived here until 1879. Again, Herbert was born in 1874. There was already 1 child, Theodore, better known as Tad, that was born just a few months before they moved into the home. Herbert in 1874, and then a younger daughter, Mary, better known as May, was born in 1876. So a family of 5 fit in this tiny quarters. Most of the sleeping was done in the bedroom, although I'm sure they had to spread out a little bit as the children got older. There was actually a story of a few times where the apprentice for Jesse in his blacksmith shop actually lived with the Hoovers in this house, so that would make it even a little bit tighter in here.
I know we're going to show the blacksmith shop in just a couple of minutes, but how authentic is the furniture inside that we're looking at?
Well, most of the furniture inside the cottage is made up of historic pieces, period pieces. We do have a few original items. The small cradle in the bedroom is the actual cradle that the Hoover children were rocked to sleep in. That was built by Jesse, and that's one of the primary original items inside. We also have in the living room here a small high chair where the Hoover children took their meals. A couple of other pieces in the building here, including the cupboard right behind the high chair, made of walnut. It was reported to us by the family that donated that piece that was made by Jesse Hoover for them, but we don't have any other supporting documentation besides their word to document that. So that is another piece that is quite possibly an original piece.
It's known to get rather cold here in eastern Iowa. It was about 32 degrees this morning. How did they keep warm?
Well, they did have a cook stove that would be moved inside. There's a chimney for that in the living room here. There's also a summer kitchen, which we'll see later on in the segment, but the house was heated by that stove in the winter. No insulation. The Hoovers, we have to remember, were a Quaker family, very devout Quaker family. They didn't let anything go to waste, so they used leftover ticking from mattresses to stuff cracks in the walls, and of course in this board and batten construction there's a little airspace in between the construction of the wall to add a little insulating layer there. So could get a little cold in here if the stove wasn't running.
Richard Norton Smith, we continue to hear about religion, Catholicism in the 1928 campaign, and his own Quaker beliefs. How important was religion to Herbert Hoover?
It was very important. I mean, it shaped Hoover in many ways, some of them less obvious ways. The Quaker Meeting House, which is here on site and has been restored to its appearance when Hoover was a boy, he remembered very poignantly sitting there as a small child, his feet didn't even touch the floor, having to remain absolutely silent, sometimes for hours on end, waiting, as Quakers do, for the inner light to speak to him, to illumine his life. He also said, not long before he died, that he was 12 years old before he realized that he could do something for joy, the sheer joy of it, without offending God. I think it suggests a kind of almost emotional straitjacket in some ways that Quakerism put him in.
We have a picture of a very young Herbert Hoover as we get a call from Baltimore, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a question for Mr. Smith and a general comment of my own. My question for Mr. Smith is about the polls of historians that rank presidents. How has Mr. Hoover fared in these polls? The first one, I think, came out after the Second World War, and the most recent one was just a few years ago. Has his standings in these polls changed over the years? Also, I've wondered about the validity of these polls. Why is it necessary to argue, should this president be number 26, 27, 28, 16? Wouldn't it be more valid to simply lump the presidents into general groups and say these are the presidents that excelled, these are the presidents that were mediocre, these fellows were near greats, and these were ineffectual, rather than fussing over whether Benjamin Harrison or Warren Harding was the worst? That's my question.
Where would you put Herbert Hoover?
I would put Herbert Hoover as one of the least effective.
Richard Norton Smith?
Well, I think, first of all, the whole poll business, it's a parlor game. And I think understandable, but not very useful. The caller was quite right. The Schlesinger poll in 1948 ranked Hoover below average. A more recent poll, which also, by the way, was heavily tilted toward liberal academics, and including some non-academic politicians, not surprisingly ranked him lower still. There are a lot of reasons for that, and you can certainly debate Hoover's presidency. We can do that. It certainly was a disappointment. But, you know, John F. Kennedy said something very interesting once, and David Herbert Donald's Lincoln, he recalls visiting the White House during the Kennedy presidency, and Kennedy said, you know, until you've sat at this desk, until you've read the mail, until you've read the memos, until you've seen what a president encounters in the context of his times, the limitations of his era, you really shouldn't judge him. He said, even poor old Buchanan, as Kennedy said, tried to do the best that he could, given what he had to work with. I think it's safe to say that Hoover's presidency in some ways is a tragedy. If Hoover had been elected in 1920, I think he might have been considered a great president. As it was, he became president when the roof fell in, economically and politically. And the theory that raised him to the presidency, this idealistic belief that government should be used to stimulate voluntary cooperation, the very thing that had led him to feed Belgium voluntarily, to run the American Food Administration for Woodrow Wilson voluntarily, to feed Russia, even though it was a Bolshevik regime after the First World War, the Mississippi flood relief effort in 1927. Hoover believed the American people were the most generous, compassionate people in the world. If you told them the problem existed, you could tap into that compassion. They would come together to help their neighbors in need. That theory and the success that arose out of it made him president. But it also raised enormous expectations on the part of the American people. He himself said before he became president he was worried that the American people had this exaggerated notion of him as a kind of Superman who could do anything. And he was frankly concerned that if some crisis beyond the normal confines of the presidency were to arise, that he might very well be sacrificed on the altars of unrealistic expectation. It happened.
Today we're hearing a Republican candidate coin the term compassionate conservatism. Is there a parallel?
Yeah, there is in many ways. Hoover believed he was looking for a third way. He was looking for a middle course between laissez-faire capitalism, what he called the philosophy of the devil take the hindmost, this callous, uncaring notion that, for example, the economy was doomed to a boom and bust cycle. Hoover didn't believe that. Hoover believed that you could, in fact, fight these economic hangovers in a number of ways. We could talk about that later on. But that there was a middle course between laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. And he had demonstrated it. He had demonstrated it in all of his various relief efforts. He always said, you know, you centralize ideas, you decentralize execution. He said the test of a democracy, as opposed to autocracy, a democracy is organized from the ground up. An autocracy is dictated to from the top down. And in many ways, his presidency became, unintentionally, a defense of this, what he called the American system, the reliance upon the individual, the neighborly individual, the community, grassroots, to retain their liberties and their generosity at the same time.
We're going to go back out to the Herbert Hoover birthplace in just a moment, but first, Scotts Valley, California, for Richard Norton Smith. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm calling to inquire regarding his foreign policy, his positions and strengths, and also Herbert Hoover's personal memberships or affiliations, Shriners or Rotaries, etc.
Thanks for the call.
Well, again, remember Hoover was a Quaker. He wasn't a pacifist as president, but he believed, he detested what he called the stupidity of war, which he had seen firsthand in World War I, feeding Belgium and the 21 countries after the war. So he was passionately committed to trying to prevent war. He pulled U.S. Marines out of Haiti, out of Nicaragua. Together with Henry Stimson, who was his Secretary of State, he negotiated 42 treaties of arbitration or conciliation with other countries around the world. First thing he did after he won the election, and even before he was inaugurated, was he left for 6 weeks to visit Latin America to inaugurate what he called the good neighbor policy, something that we all associate with Franklin Roosevelt. So he was well aware of the fact that there was a kind of an ugly American image even then in much of Latin America, and he wanted to try to combat that. The question about his affiliations or associations, they were countless. You know, when he died, he held the world's record for honorary degrees. He had received 90. Father Hesburgh of Notre Dame has since surpassed him. He was passionately committed to the Boys Clubs of America. He talked about what he called his pavement boys. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars. He doubled the number of boys clubs in the United States. He was very active in that. Mrs. Hoover, you know, was president of the Girl Scouts for a number of years, and not just a name on a letterhead, but the next time you buy Girl Scout cookies, that was one of Lou Henry Hoover's innovations.
We'll go back outside. Dan Banta with the National Park Service is joining us in the kitchen where Herbert Hoover was born and raised the first couple of years of his life. Dan Banta, show us around.
Yeah, we're standing on the back porch now, and this was an area where Herbert Hoover's mother, Huldah, actually probably sat and watched the children play in the backyard quite a bit. And it's actually also an area we think was probably enclosed, especially as the children were getting older, to create a little more sleeping room for the family. Another room, as we mentioned inside, that was blatantly missing inside was the kitchen. And this is the summer kitchen, almost a large closet where, of course, food storage would take place, and all the family cooking in the summer months to get the stove out of the main part of the house anyway, and prevent overheating the house.
What about the winter months?
Winter months, the stove could have been picked up, moved inside, and then that would have been used to heat the house. This small room would have again been used either for sleeping quarters if it was warm enough, or for storage, food storage, and so forth.
Richard Norton Smith, give us a brief chronology of Herbert Hoover's life.
Well, it was 90 years old. I was 90 years, extraordinarily crowded. He was born in 1874. He lost his mother. He lost his father when he was 6, his mother when he was 9. 2 years later, he was put on a train with 2 dimes and a hamper of homemade delicacies and sent on a 1-week trip by train to Oregon, where he lived with a Quaker uncle, John Minthorn, and his wife. Minthorn started the Oregon Land Company. Hoover went to work for him. He, at the age of 17, became the first overnight student at Stanford University, the youngest member of the so-called pioneer class. That's where he met Miss Lou Henry, his fellow Iowan, who was also interested in geology. In fact, she's the first woman that we know of to earn a geology degree. An intellectual in her own right. She would speak 5 languages. Extraordinary person. And then, after he graduated in 1895, he worked for a couple summers for the U.S. Geological Survey, worked in a mine as a mucker in the Sierra Nevadas. In 1896, went and got a job in San Francisco, and there, I guess lightning struck. That's when this is a wonderful picture. He's 23 years old. Louis Jardine, who was an engineer in San Francisco, heard from a firm called Buick Mooring, and they were looking for someone who was 35 years of age, with 75 years of experience, as they put it, to go to Australia and take charge of their entire mining operations there in the outback. And Herbert Hoover inflated his credentials. He grew that mustache. He put on that ridiculous Edwardian outfit to look older, and he got the job. And so he was 23 years old, a couple years out of Stanford, and suddenly he found himself in the land down under, what he called the land of red dust, black flies, and white heat. God-forsaken place then and now, running an enormous mining operation. He did well enough there that he was hired by the government of China at the ripe old age of 25. He wired a marriage proposal to Lou Henry. They were married 100 years ago this year in Monterey, California. Next day they set sail for China, found themselves caught up in the Boxer Rebellion. Great adventure. Lou thought it was all very exciting. She wrote a letter to her friend, "By not being here, you are missing one of the great sieges of the age," she said. And she used to sweep the bullets off her front porch every morning. This extraordinary, colorful life. The Hoovers would spend 2 years of their lives on board ships, traveling from country to country to country with his worldwide engineering enterprises. And then, of course, after World War I broke out in 1914, the great engineer became the great humanitarian. They were living in London. He was approached about, first of all, there were 120,000 Americans stranded in Europe. And how were they going to get home? Hoover undertook to organize to get 120,000 people home. He raised the money from fellow engineers. He loaned personal funds. All but $400 of what he loaned was repaid, which is the beginning again of this faith that in the generosity, the honesty, the decency of the American people. And the success there led immediately to something called the Committee for the Relief of Belgium. Belgium was trapped. There was a British blockade, German occupation. 8 million people were threatened with starvation. Hoover fed them for the next 4 years. He raised $1 billion, and that was a lot of money in those days. This was the world's first large-scale organized humanitarian effort. His success there led Woodrow Wilson to bring him home to organize the American Food Administration. Food will win the war, voluntary food conservation, meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays. The next time you chew sugarless gum, that's an offshoot of Herbert Hoover's Food Administration. He fed Russia after the war, created something called the European Relief Council, which was a forerunner of CARE. And in 1920, with his heroic reputation, both parties wanted to run him for president. Warren Harding made him Secretary of Commerce. Calvin Coolidge resented Hoover's activism. Hoover was popularly known as Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of everything else, which didn't sit too well with Mr. Coolidge and his rather laissez-faire notions. But in 1928, the Republicans nominated him for president. He was overwhelmingly elected, and then the roof fell in several months after his inauguration. But not, it should be pointed out, before he embarked upon a whirlwind of reform. I mean, the New Republic said the first weeks of the Hoover presidency were the most ambitious and aggressive since Theodore Roosevelt. He came into office with a long list of reforms that he wanted to undertake. And again, the real tragedy of the Hoover presidency, besides its timing, is the fact that he really was never allowed to do what he wanted to do.
And we'll get to his presidency and his post-presidential years in just a couple of minutes. He died in 1964 at the age of 90.
Yeah, in October 1964. He'd had a picture, his last picture taken 2 months before on his 90th birthday. Didn't want to have his picture taken. And then someone pointed out to him, well, after all, John Adams, the only other president who lived to 90, would have wanted to have his picture taken. So Hoover relented. Adams outlived him by 4 months. But Hoover had the longest ex-presidency.
He is buried just behind us. Did he want to be buried here?
He is. In fact, it's a wonderful story which sort of gives the lie to the popular notion of Hoover's this very dry, untheatrical sort. If there's the gravesite you're looking at right now, Hoover decided that he wanted to be buried on this overlook where he'd known as a boy, used to slide in the winter months. And 2 very simple slabs, Quaker style, just the names and the dates. But the real story here is the view from the overlook. It's about 450 yards from the overlook to that little white cottage where he was born, which is 14 by 20 feet. That's the size of the average American living room today. And Hoover decreed, before he died, that nothing could ever be built or planted that would interrupt the view, the unobstructed view between the gravesite and the cottage, because he wanted people who came to visit to look off at that little tiny house and make the connection, which to him was the essence of Americanism, that in this country, your origins didn't matter. Anything was possible. You could be an orphaned Quaker boy in a 2-room cottage, and you could live in the White House one day.
Dan Banta, is this a fair representation of his early years?
I believe so, yeah. We have several historic resources and buildings here in the National Historic Site that really tell that story of those first 11 years. And we do get the question from time to time, well, this is a pretty short period of time, especially for a man who lived to be 90 years old. But we have to remember that the time that he spent here in this small cottage and in the second home, which would have been just about a block to my right, that this was the time he spent with his family. So he had very fond childhood memories of West Branch and especially of the time he spent with his family.
How many people come through here yearly?
Well, we get about, it varies a little bit depending on some of the special events that go on, but we get around 250,000 people a year. Quite a few of those come in right off the interstate as they're passing through on Interstate 80. We also have a lot of school tours this time of year and also in the spring.
I know you're going to show us the blacksmith shop in a couple of minutes, but what else is around the historic site, the museum, the library that people can see?
Sure. We have, of course, the birthplace cottage. We also have a Friends Meeting House, or a Quaker meeting house, where the Hoover family worshipped. It was built in 1856, and it's still a nice representation of the Quaker meeting. That's divided in half. The women would have sat on the right, the men on the left, and visitors can go inside there, take their seats on either side if they so chose. We also have a schoolhouse, which I believe we'll see in a shot over near the blacksmith shop, which was the first schoolhouse built in West Branch. It was built in 1853, just as West Branch was being settled, and it was just a small one-room schoolhouse, which also served as the first Friends Meeting House in West Branch. So several historic structures that played a vital role in Hoover's growing up.
And of course, there's the obligatory outhouse.
That's right, that's right. Probably maybe the most important room at the cottage here, one of the most popular with the school children, that's for sure.
What are some of the most commonly asked questions for visitors?
Well, we get all kinds, of course. Where did they sleep in this little house, which we've already shown you. A lot of questions about what happened when they moved out of this house, and the answer to that, as I mentioned, they did move into a second home in 1879. Jesse sold his blacksmith shop and sold the property that we're standing on now with the birthplace cottage, and moved into a home they called the House of Maples due to the large maple trees that surrounded it. It was about a block to our south. And they moved into that house until both Jesse and Huldah passed away, Huldah in 1884. Then the Hoover children were spread out with other family members. In 1890, a family by the name of Skellers purchased this property that the birthplace cottage sits on, including the cottage. And it's kind of an interesting story. They actually picked the cottage up and moved it behind me here about 30 feet. Turned it 90 degrees and added on a two-story addition, two-story house to the front of that. And that's depicted in this little picture here. If we can get a close-up of that, this might look familiar. This is a rather famous Grant Wood print. You can see right about here, this would have been the cottage attached to the two-story dwelling on front. And this was owned by the Skellers clear up until the Hoovers were able to purchase this property back in 1935. And that was largely due to Lou Henry's work. And the family, as well as a hard-working group of individuals called the Hoover Birthplace Society here in West Branch, worked very hard to try to purchase this property back from Mrs. Skellers, who at the time was taking people through the house, charging them a dime, and selling hot dogs also. So several questions about Hoover's life after the cottage, as well as the basics of when he lived here.
Dan Banta, we thank you. A second-generation park ranger here at the Hoover Library, helps run the facility. We'll join you in a couple of minutes as we look at other exhibits, including the blacksmith shop. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Steve.
Back to your calls. Jacksonville, Florida. Good morning.
Yes, sir. I have often heard as a student of history that President Roosevelt actually adopted many of the programs that he adopted to correct the Depression, such as CCC, Public Works, and the Bankers' Holiday, were actually programs that Mr. Hoover had advocated and had advanced during the latter days of his presidency and during the campaign for the presidency.
It's a fascinating, albeit speculative, question, and it continues to engage a lot of historians in terms of just how many connections are there between Hoover's term and Roosevelt's. Let me give you a couple examples. The very first thing Hoover did when he became president, there was a great farm crisis in this country. Agricultural America had been in a depression long before Wall Street crashed. And Hoover set out, he called a special session of Congress, and he created something called the Federal Farm Board, which represented certainly by far the largest intervention by Washington into any sector of the private economy. And the Federal Farm Board was set up to rely upon farm cooperatives to try to stabilize the market and the amount that was being produced. But if that didn't work, Washington was prepared in a worst-case scenario to purchase surplus crops. By 1931, the Federal Farm Board was asking southern state governors to plow under every third row of cotton in an effort, obviously, to restrict the crop. And the New York Times, of all things, said it was one of the maddest things ever to come from an official body. Well, of course, there you have the AAA, and it's, in effect, the politics of scarcity, plowing on crops and killing pigs and so on and so on. You mentioned the bank crisis. In fact, while Hoover and Roosevelt were barely on speaking terms by the time of March 4th, 1933, those just below them, in particular the Treasury Department, were working literally all night long to coordinate a response to the bank crisis. And in fact, Roosevelt's first fireside chat and his banking legislation that closed the banks and provided for their orderly reopening in a matter of a few days, as it turned out, was written in the Hoover Treasury Department. And Hoover's outgoing Secretary of the Treasury, a man named Ogden Mills, worked very close with Roosevelt's incoming Secretary, a man named Will Wooden. So there is, in fact, there is some cooperation that went on at that point. The larger issue of how much Hoover anticipated the New Deal, I think you can exaggerate it. I think Hoover himself, it wasn't so much that Hoover was anticipating the New Deal. Hoover was carrying on in his tradition that you'd seen at the Commerce Department, using government, to be sure, but using government, again, to stimulate grassroots voluntary action, rather than, government was a last resort, not a first resort.
Herbert Hoover left West Branch, Iowa in the mid-1880s to move on to Oregon to live with a relative. He came back to Iowa a number of times, including October 4th, 1932, where he launched his re-election campaign against President Franklin Roosevelt, or then Governor Franklin Roosevelt. We'll show you some scenes from Des Moines, and you'll notice some of the displays of anger by the farmers here in Iowa. As we show you this scene, we'll get a call from Salt Lake City, Utah. Go ahead, please.
Hi, good morning. I have a question about the Belgian Relief Fund and Hoover's time in London. In 1916, weren't the Germans ready to sue for peace? They were out of supplies, out of coal, out of ammunition, and Belgium had just had its most record crop of food almost ever in history before. So didn't Hoover agree to organize this Belgian Relief Fund, but really what it was a front to get supplies and food and things to the Germans so that the war would continue to bring the United States into the war later on.
Thanks,
and also, about London, wasn't Hoover banned from the London Stock Exchange as a swindler?
Thanks very much. Let's get to that point, but let's talk about some of this video that we were just looking, the film from 1932, his re-election campaign.
Well, yeah, I mean, by that point, Hoover was the Flying Dutchman of American politics. I mean, his campaign was doomed from the start. The Farm Board had been overwhelmed, as had virtually anything else he'd tried to do with the farm economy. So he came home. It was a less than stellar homecoming. At other places, the reaction was even worse. I mean, he had tomatoes thrown at him in Detroit. Light bulbs were thrown. There were death threats. It was a pretty bleak campaign, and this is an indication of just how far his stock had fallen. He went into office. The great engineer, Calvin Coolidge called him the Wonder Boy, and he left office. Probably the most hated man in America. Time magazine called him President Reject. And, in some ways it's ironically evidence of the modern presidency. That is, we tend to personalize, we tend to personify public events through the man in the Oval Office. And that really came of age in Hoover's presidency, obviously to his detriment.
The caller's point about the Belgian relief program?
Yeah, that's bizarre. Hoover spent 4 years struggling against enormous odds between German militarists and British militarists, none of whom wanted to help. Basically, the British said, let the German feed the Belgians, and the Germans were actually taking reparations out of Belgium. That was... he later on said, at a moment, rather bleak moment late in life, he said that if only he hadn't said yes when they approached him about feeding Belgium, then his life would have been so different because he never would have been president. And the rest was unspoken. But And the London stock, no, he had problems in London. Winston Churchill, for example, despised Hoover, and Hoover didn't care for Winston Churchill. But they were questions of military aid. I mean, again, from the British standpoint, why should we relieve the Germans of their moral obligation to feed the countries that they're occupying? So Hoover and Churchill were never close.
And again, going back to your book, and I think this was in 19...
Actually, Hoover at one point was invited to join the British cabinet as Minister of Munitions. Lord Kitchener thought enough of his record. He wanted actually to have him come into the cabinet, and Hoover said, "I'll be damned if I give up my American citizenship."
This is from 1938, I believe, after he left the White House, before World War II broke out, a meeting with Adolf Hitler.
A very strange meeting with a very strange man. Hoover went back to Germany. He went to a number of European countries in the late 30s, and he was lionized wherever he went by a generation that remembered his relief efforts. And in Germany, he did not know when he went to Germany that he would be meeting Hitler, but he went to meet Hitler, and he said it was strange. You would have a conversation with this man. It would seem perfectly rational, perfectly normal, until you pushed a button. If you mentioned democracy or the Jews, you'd set him off, and Hitler would rant and rave and shout and denounce, and the Hitler of legend.
Herbert Hoover, our 31st president, as we continue C-SPAN's American President Series with Richard Norton Smith, who launched the program back in March.
Yes. Well, it's appropriate, too, because, of course, Hoover was president during George Washington's bicentennial celebration. So the George Washington Parkway, in fact, outside Washington, D.C., was one of the many public works projects that Hoover undertook during the Depression.
And a distant cousin of Richard Nixon, Herbert Hoover.
Yes. Yes, in fact, he is a distant cousin of Richard Nixon. Both Quakers, both raised Quakers.
Bellport, New York, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'm Bellport, New my name is Sam Family. I was wondering, everybody that gets introduced to having the name Hoover, you have Hoover back and Hoover. I also was wondering, if he's related to
Caller, I'm going to have to stop you because we can't hear your question. We'll try to, if we can clear up the line, we'll come back to you. Why don't we get a call from St. Louis, Missouri? Good morning.
Good morning. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, first, I heard some quotes a while back by Harry Truman regarding how much he admired him, so that caused me to go and reread, about him. And, he always received, so much blame for the Great Depression, but all of Franklin Roosevelt's programs did not really end the Depression. You needed World War II, I suppose, to do it, because he really didn't do it with all his programs. And he also inherited the mess that caused the stock market. And since this is a bipartisan government and all, what kind of a Congress did he have? Did he have a Republican Congress or a Democrat? I mean, you can't just have this whole thing happening because of one person, but it's sure easy to blame one person, though.
Thanks, caller. First, the relationship. And there's a book based on the Truman-Hoover relationship.
It does surprise people. Hoover, by and large, got along better with Democratic presidents. Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman. He was actually friends with John F. Kennedy, who came to this suite more than once to visit Hoover. Hoover was very close to the Kennedy family. We can talk about that later. But yes, there's a great story about Harry Truman, who was a real class act and who brought Hoover out of purgatory, in a sense, who invited him back to the White House after World War II, in fact, really in the first few weeks of his presidency, and said that he would like to meet him, like to become acquainted with him. And Hoover went. They had a long talk. They talked particularly about the post-war situation in Europe and the likelihood that there would be great food shortages, possibly famine, destitution, disease. And subsequently, Mr. Truman asked Hoover to undertake a round-the-world, 38-nation relief effort. And Hoover, who at that point was 72 years old, was thrilled. I mean, he said later on that Harry Truman added 10 years to his life. And even though Truman attacked him in the 48 campaign and called up all the old images about the Depression, he said, that's just politics. That's nothing personal, that's just politics. Well, Truman was a much better politician than Hoover, because Hoover took it personally. And yet, then Truman, of course, asked Hoover to have the first Hoover Commission to reorganize the executive branch of government, which had become bloated by war and the Depression. Sweeping reforms were undertaken. As a result, Truman was very supportive of that effort. They became very close friends, and so it was a very natural thing when Truman dedicated his library in '57. He wanted Mr. Hoover there, and then 5 years later, likewise, the favor was returned.
We're going to show you around the library as well here, but first, Princeton, Texas. You're on C-SPAN. Go ahead, please.
Am I on the air?
You sure are.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the Veterans Bonus March in the early 30s, where Douglas MacArthur was put in charge to disperse it, and he disobeyed Hoover's orders, apparently, and yet Hoover took all the blame for it, and Douglas MacArthur went scot-free.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting case, and again, it illustrates in some ways the ill-starred nature of the Hoover presidency. You might also say it illustrates Hoover's failings as a politician, because you're quite right. Hoover, basically, the Bonus Army had come to town, several thousand strong. They had a main camp over in Anacostia in southeast Washington, and there were a number of demonstrations. They wanted a World War I bonus, which had been approved, moved up. They wanted it paid much more quickly. And interestingly enough, Hoover was by no means alone in opposing this. Congress opposed it as well. Both parties opposed it. Get back to the question the earlier caller asked. If anything, the Democratic leaders in Congress, Speaker John Garner and Senate Majority Leader Joe Robinson, were to the right of Hoover in a number of ways. In any event, they certainly didn't want to pay the bonus. So what they did do, Congress voted some funds to pay the passage, to send the bonus marchers back where they came from. Most of them took Congress up on that offer, but not all of them did. There were some communists, some communist agitators, although I think that was probably exaggerated at the time. Anyway, the District of Columbia informed the White House that it could not, in fact, guarantee order in downtown Washington. Hoover asked his Secretary of War, Patrick Hurley, to see to it that order was enforced. He gave specific instructions to be particularly careful in terms of women and children. He didn't want excessive force used. Hurley turned to Douglas MacArthur, who was then Chief of Staff. MacArthur went home, put on his full-dress uniform with all the medals. Young Colonel Dwight Eisenhower urged him, stay away, don't personalize this. But in fact, tanks rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue, one of them commanded by George Patton, another up-and-coming soldier. And not only did they clear the streets of downtown Washington, as Hoover had requested, but in fact, MacArthur disobeyed the president's orders. He crossed into Anacostia, burned the camp, certainly used more than appropriate force, and then, to make things worse, came back, had a press conference, and thanked the president for taking such bold and decisive action. There you see General MacArthur dressed for action. Hoover, in fact, did not learn the full extent of MacArthur's insubordination for many years. He never publicly upbraided MacArthur. He claimed to have privately done so. But even when he wrote his memoirs, he skirted the issue.
Richard Norton Smith writes about that in his book, An Uncommon Man, The Triumph of Herbert Hoover. McMinnville, Oregon, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention that Dr. Minthorn's house is open in Newburgh, and that's where he grew up, not in Salem, but he probably did work the onion fields down there. But it's just off, it's on Highway 99W, and it's just off I-5, so anybody that's traveling in the area, it gives you another side, very quaint Victorian, very small, very quick. One is still predominantly Quaker, and it's just another thought.
Thank you, caller. And there's a story about the doctor who lived here in West Branch, and during his early years, Herbert Hoover nearly died.
Yeah, as an infant, Hoover almost died with croup. And in fact, the story goes that coins were placed, dimes were placed on his eyes. They had given this infant up for lost. And Dr. Minthorn came and revived the child. And ironically, a dozen years later, it would be John Minthorn who would say, send the boy to us, when he was orphaned. And the caller's quite right. The house is in Newburgh. George Fox College out there does a number of Hoover-related programs. And she's also right about the onion fields. Hoover, one of his jobs out there was to weed the onion fields for 50 cents a day, which was actually a real advance because here, growing up in West Branch, he remembered picking potato bugs at 100 per penny, and the proceeds were used to buy 4th of July fireworks.
Tim Walsh is Richard Norton Smith's successor here at the Herbert Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa, and one of the exhibits, The Years of Adventure. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Steve.
What's behind you?
Well, behind me over my left shoulder is Herbert Hoover kneeling at a mining camp in Australia, and we heard earlier from Richard about the travails of having worked in Australia. This gallery focuses on several different periods of Mr. Hoover's early years, including his education at Stanford University, his first real job, which was in Western Australia, and then his marriage, and finally his years of adventure in China. Richard has touched upon all of those in his earlier remarks.
Richard Norton Smith, we saw the picture of the mustache and the beard. Did he shave it when he moved to Australia?
Not only did he shave it, a friend in California received a package with a tweed suit in it, which he had bought at the time when he was trying to impress his employers. And he said, "Here, you take this damn thing. I haven't worn it once." Needless to say, in Coolgardie, Australia, tweed suits were not in fashion. This was a place where less than an inch of rain fell every year, desert conditions, very hot. I mean, just hellish.
Tim Walsh, when people look at that exhibit, what do they learn about Herbert Hoover?
What they learn is the amazing persistence that this man had. He, after his time in Oregon with his uncle, he applied to Stanford University as a very young student without much high school education, as we would consider it today, and was turned down. It was a brand new university, and consequently they were offering free admission to the very first class. So it was quite competitive. Well, Hoover was turned down. He came to Palo Alto during the summer of 1891 and applied himself, took the admission test again, and was so eager to enter that, as Richard mentioned, he was the very first student registered at Encino Hall at Stanford University. So the Stanford experience was a terrific test for him very early on, and he really found Stanford a kind of metaphorical home. He met his best friends there. Ray Lyman Wilbur, who later was his Secretary of the Interior, had gone to school with him. He met his wife, Lou, and that's a part of the exhibit as well. Lou had asked a professor, could a woman study geology? And consequently, John Branner said, why, yes. And so she, after trying school teaching, decided to enter Stanford University, in which she did, and met Herbert Hoover in the chemistry lab. And there was personal chemistry there, and of course they would marry 100 years ago this year in February of 1899. So that experience at Stanford is documented in part of our exhibit here. We had to scour, quite almost literally, to find memorabilia. There are several items in the cases, his class notes, some football tickets. He was manager of the football team when that meant arranging for games. He also, we also have his yearbook and some other things. He studied geology, as Richard had mentioned, with the idea of pursuing a career in mine engineering. Perhaps the most unusual item we have in that part of the exhibit, though, is a chair, because on the seat of the chair is carved the name Hoover 95. So clearly at some point in his dorm room, perhaps bored, he'd taken out his penknife and carved his legacy into the seat of the chair. So that, of course, that always amuses the 5th and 6th graders when they come here because, of course, they're told, please do not deface any of the school property. But we do have that on the chair. And that's the part of Hoover's early education, or his education, that we try to tell here in our exhibit. A good part of his other memorabilia related to Stanford is still at Stanford University. Before we have you move to the next part of the exhibit, when did he start making money? At what age? Well, I think Herbert Hoover was working all the way through his life. You know, he was never a very wealthy man until after he ended his mining career about in 1914. His wealth really from 1900 to 1914 grew extraordinarily. But even while he was at Stanford, he was working, so he was always making money. We'll get a call from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Hello?
Yes.
Hi, I'm sorry.
I didn't know if you heard me. How was Mr. Hoover's relationship with his son J. Edgar, and did he know of any of the things that supposedly J. Edgar did while he was running the FBI?
Was there
No
a relationship?
relation. No relation at all. It is astonishing to this day, at least when I was still here, we used to get people who would ask about J. Edgar Hoover and Hoover vacuum cleaners, and neither of which have the slightest bit of relationship with Mr. Hoover.
Denver, good morning.
Morning. In view of today's arguments on free trade, I wanted to ask Mr. Smith about Hoover's opinion on the Smoot-Hawley tariff and whether Mr. Smith thought that was a triggering event for the Great Depression.
It's a fair question, and it's something that people continue to debate. And it is certainly one of those things that is often pointed to as a contributing factor to making what was, in fact, a recession a depression. I personally, I think it was probably the biggest mistake Hoover made as president, signing Smoot-Hawley. Remember, the tariff had bedeviled Republican presidents. William Howard Taft had come into office 20 years earlier, pledging tariff reform, and then got taken to the cleaners by protectionists in his own party, and signed a tariff and paid a great price for it. Hoover, I think, would tell you that it wasn't a surrender on his part. He thought he was going to get a reconstituted tariff commission that would allow him as president unilaterally to raise or lower most tariffs on items by up to 50%. So that in return for trading some higher rates on some manufactured and farm products, and again, remember, who wanted the higher tariffs? The farm regions that were suffering dire straits throughout the 20s. He thought in return for that he would get this authority. Well, of course, history records it didn't work out that way, and it's been rather harsh. Over 100 of the leading economists of the day took out a famous ad in the New York Times imploring him not to sign Smoot-Hawley. He disregarded their advice.
Bethesda, Maryland, you're next.
My memory may be wrong on this, but I was appalled when Hoover died that none of the leaders of the Republican Party, and I think Eisenhower was still alive at that time, went to his funeral.
Actually, that's an interesting point. I don't think there was any slight intended. There was a service. There were services in New York and in Washington, and then here in West Branch. And the service here in West Branch was actually intended to be much more of a kind of family hometown event. In fact, Barry Goldwater and William Miller and Lyndon Johnson all attended the service that you see in New York City at St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, which is on Park Avenue right next to the Waldorf Towers. That's also, by the way, where Mrs. Hoover's funeral had been held in 1944. What was really touching was when they came out to Iowa and they drove down from the airport in Cedar Rapids. It was a brilliant October day, much like this, a little bit warmer than this, and people lined the route. Thousands and thousands of people lined the route, and in fact, it's estimated that there were 80,000 people surrounding this library. They were not admitted up on the overlook where the burial took part. They stood in respectful silence, and their tribute, I think, would have touched Hoover more than anything that any elected official might have said or done.
Tim Walsh has moved to another part of the gallery here at the Hoover Library Museum in West Branch, Iowa. How did somebody who was a successful mining engineer become what the exhibit calls him, a great humanitarian?
Yes, Steve, we're standing in our humanitarian gallery, and it's kind of like a food warehouse because about 1914, the ambassador of the United States to Great Britain, Walter Hines Page, came to Hoover and said, people are starving in Europe. Can you do something? I know you're a great organizer. I'm in need. Is there some way you can help? And Mr. Hoover said, I'm going to set aside my public career and turn my life to humanitarianism. It was almost a spur-of-the-moment decision. He, first of all, got Americans out of Europe in the summer, or the late summer and fall of 1914, and then turned his attention to food relief to the starving children of Belgium and northern France.
And behind me, we see some sacks of the food that Mr. Hoover might have sent over to Europe. And these sacks contain flour and sugar. They also ship fat, because that was needed to add calories to the diet of children. And as the way of saying thank you, the people of Belgium and northern France sent those sacks back to Mr. Hoover embroidered. And we have a collection of over 400 flour sacks. We show about 6 or 7 of them at a time on display, which basically it's the most touching way someone could say thank you. It's a way of embroidering that special love that was so important to them, because their stomachs were filled. They had a sense of relief that they were going to make it through the war. Many of these sacks came back in the shape of pillows, and we even have some that are golf club covers and so forth. Most of them, however, as you're seeing, they're just flat sacks, stitching, even the lettering that was on the sacks themselves. So he fed somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million people in Belgium and northern France, and overall during the course of his public life, something like 1.2 billion people.
And you said this was around 1914?
1914 to 1917. Then in 1917 he returned to the United States and he became U.S. Food Administrator. And Richard had mentioned that story earlier, how he contributed to the United States effort. But we have to explain to our visitors that between 1914 and 1917, of course, the United States wasn't involved in war, so Mr. Hoover could act as a humanitarian. He did this through an organization called the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. He had his own ships, his own flag, and he basically negotiated with the Germans on one side and the British on the other to bring that food in to support those starving people. And organizations that we have today, like CARE and Oxfam and UNICEF, really draw their organizational origins from Herbert Hoover's efforts to feed the people of Belgium and northern France in World War I.
Tim Walsh is the director of the library here. We will check back with you in a couple of minutes. Issachar, Washington is next for Richard Norton Smith. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I was raised in Boulder City, Nevada, where the Boulder Dam, at that time, was called the Boulder Dam. Now it is, of course, the Hoover Dam. And we were told that Hoover helped engineer the construction of that dam. Is that true?
Well, actually, in a sense, it is true, ma'am. What happened was, as Secretary of Commerce, Hoover undertook something called the Colorado River Compact. And as you can imagine, water, as you know, is worth its weight in gold in those parts, and particularly in those days. And a number of western and southwestern states were squabbling over the water in the Colorado River. And Hoover brought them all together, and basically they had hammered out this agreement, which was the necessary forerunner to the dam. And so he did initiate the dam as Secretary of Commerce. And then, of course, you know, there was this amusing, one of the things he was grateful to Harry Truman for, because Truman restored the name, Hoover Dam, to the dam, which had been taken away, renamed Boulder Dam during the Roosevelt presidency by Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, who was no friend of Hoover's. And Will Rogers had a wonderful radio commentary. He said, now, the perfect solution would have been if they had reversed names and called it Dam Ickes.
We're joined by one of the educators who work at Peggy Mannion at Roosevelt Junior High School in San Francisco. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you.
We have a clip. The school was dedicated, I believe it was 1956. June 11th was the newspaper from the San Francisco Call Record. And in his speech to the students, he said that you need have no fears of your future. Do not think it is a cold, hard world you are going into. You will find a kindliness and helpfulness from your elders. They want you to succeed.
That's right.
What can you tell us about the school?
The school is located in San Francisco. It's Herbert Hoover Middle School. Was, as you said, he came to the dedication in 1956 in June. It actually opened that January, and he came in June. And apparently, I've spoken to a teacher who was here at the time, and she said it was marvelous. Thousands of people came to the dedication, and that he was, you know, he was very nice, quite a gentleman, and very impressive. And he, as you quoted from his speech, he he was encouraging the students to, do what they could, and that he was hopeful that they would become, I thought, it was great leaders, great artists, and great engineers.
Aside from the name, what do students at the junior high school learn about Herbert Hoover?
Well, I'm a U.S. history teacher, and we teach about the presidents, all of the presidents, more of a biography. We don't go into the 20th century because that's in the 11th grade. But most of the U.S. history teachers here do bios of all the presidents, and I start every year with all of my classes discussing Herbert Hoover because I kind of think it's important. They're at a school, and a lot of our students have not been born in this country, and I think they should know the man whom the school was named after. So I spend, about a day talking about him.
Richard Norton Smith, how many Hoover schools are there around the country?
There are about 60. And he said more than once that to have a school named after you is the greatest honor that can come to an American.
Peggy Mannion, what do you find most intriguing about our 31st president?
Well, I'm kind of sad that when I was growing up, when we talked about Hoover, when I learned about Hoover, everybody was blaming the Depression on him, and that kind of makes me feel badly because he did so many other things. The great humanitarian, he was an engineer, he was a statesman, and he did so many things, and then he got this tag attached to him about the Depression, which was so complex that you can't blame it on him. I think that he was genuinely a good person and genuinely cared about fixing the problems of the country when he was president, but they just got beyond him at some point.
And before we let you go, you said that you had spoken to a teacher who was there when the Hoover Junior High School was dedicated. Is there a plaque or are there pictures commemorating that event?
Yes, we have a hall case that has all of the memorabilia. He apparently gave us some books that he autographed, that he had written, that are in the hall case. And the teacher I talked to said she can remember that. She was 15 feet from him, and she can remember as clearly as if it were yesterday. So it was just a highlight of everything, of her life, to see the President Hoover here.
Peggy Mannion, who is an 8th grade U.S. history teacher at Herbert Hoover Junior High School in San Francisco, thank you for joining us.
You're quite welcome.
And this is a reminder for all of you educators who want to get more information on C-SPAN's American President Series. We have a number set aside for you, or you can go online. Our address on the internet is cspan.org/classroom, or you can call 202-626-4858. That's 202-626-4858, and operators are standing by to give you more information on Herbert Hoover and the rest of the American presidents. As we continue our series, we'll take a short break and be back with much more.
President's Life Portrait Series, we feature President Herbert Hoover. This program is about 2.5 hours.
I prefer to think of Iowa as I saw it through the eyes of a 10-year-old boy. Those were eyes filled with the wonders of Iowa's streams and woods. They saw days filled with adventure, with participation in good and comforting things.
Herbert Hoover carried fond memories of his Iowa childhood until the end of his 90 years. But all was not idyllic for the young future president, who was orphaned at age 9, and a year later sent to live with a Quaker uncle in Oregon. It was there that his already formidable self-reliance developed into a salient trait that would one day characterize his term in office.
My boyhood ambition was to be able to earn my own living without the help of anybody, anywhere.
As a young adult, Hoover made extra money working in the onion fields near his home in Salem, Oregon. He attended business school at age 14 and 3 years later became the youngest member of Stanford University's pioneer class of 1891. At Stanford, he developed two interests, engineering and fellow geology student Lou Henry, whose natural intelligence and appetite for adventure matched his own. They married in 1899 and would have two boys.
Before 265 people, our 31st president, Herbert Hoover. Downey Street serves as the main walk through the Hoover Historic Site. Now back live with live pictures around the library and museum, including the Jesse Hoover Blacksmith Shop. And we're joined again by Dan Banta, who is with the National Park Service. Thanks for rejoining us, Mr. Banta.
Glad to be here.
What can you tell us about the shop, the blacksmith shop?
Well, Jesse Hoover by trade was a blacksmith, and he operated a blacksmith shop just across the street from the cottage that he built in 1871. He operated that shop until about 1879. The building that we're in now is actually a reconstruction of a typical blacksmith shop from the time period, not the original. The original sat just a few feet to my left. The blacksmith shop was a place where Jesse spent most of his days. He worked very hard here. He became a very successful blacksmith. In fact, he advertised that he specialized in plows and horseshoeing. So he did do a lot of business over here. Herbert Hoover and also his older brother Tad helped out around the shop, sweeping and so forth. And in fact, one of Herbert Hoover's fondest memories of his father, which were very few, unfortunately, was playing around the blacksmith shop. And he later wrote in his memoirs that while he was playing around the blacksmith shop, he stepped on a chip of hot iron and carried the brand of Iowa on his foot to that day. So several memories from the blacksmith shop for Herbert Hoover.
Just two children in the Hoover household?
Well, there were three children. Mary was the youngest, was the daughter, and she didn't help out over here quite as much as Herbert and Tad did. Of course, she was a little bit younger, and the boys would like to come over here a little bit more, and probably did as much playing as they did work over here, but liked to help their dad out in his shop. In 1879, Jesse actually sold this shop and bought a farm implement store just a couple blocks from here on Main Street in West Branch, where he only was able to operate that business for about a year and a half until his early death in 1880.
And again, at that time, only a couple hundred people lived here in West Branch. What was life like then?
West Branch was in a lot of ways very similar to how it is today. Still a small community, although it's about 2,000 people now. Very much centered around farming and agribusiness. Small businesses such as the blacksmith and the farm implement store in town, and several other small businesses that were prevalent at the time and made up the small town of West Branch. 16 of the buildings in downtown West Branch are on the National Register of Historic Places, partially as a tribute to that golden era of agriculture at the time.
Including Herb and Lou's restaurant. Richard Norton Smith, when people drive through West Branch, do they get a sense of the community?
Oh, they do. It's a marvelous a time capsule, really. It's a time step still here. And Herbert Lou's, by the way, is the best pizza you'll have. You have to go over there before you leave. Young Bert Hoover, as a boy, said later on, tongue-in-cheek somewhat, that his reading as a child was limited to the Bible, to certain novels showing the corrupting influence of demon rum, and to the Youth's Companion, which he surreptitiously stashed in a haystack to ward off its corrupting influences. He didn't really become a scholar, even at Stanford. It was really actually when he went off to Australia, had a lot of time in his hands, became defective of his meager early education. Then he really began a massive program of reading and did that right for the rest of his life.
Dan Banta, we're going to let you go. Thanks very much for sharing your stories with us as we look at the blacksmith doing his work there at the Jesse Hoover Blacksmith Shop. And we'll get a call from Gastonia, North Carolina. Good morning.
I'm a Truman buff, actually, but I read in several biographies about Truman that he could not understand why the presidents that were before him, like Hoover, who had such experience in food relief, were not used. And I believe Truman tried to get Hoover to help with food relief in the Truman administration, and I can't remember if he did or didn't, and I'd just like to know the answer, and I'll hang up right now and just listen.
Thank you.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit earlier, ma'am. He did indeed, and it was the basis for a very, very close friendship that endured until Hoover's death. By the way, the whole notion of what to do with former presidents, Hoover talked about that a little bit, because he said, you know, from time to time there have been suggestions that former presidents should be made ex officio members of the Senate. And he said at my time in life, the idea of sitting on a hard bench listening to a lot of speeches doesn't hold much appeal.
202-624-1111 for those of you in the Eastern and Central time zones, 202-624-1115 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Our look today, Herbert Hoover, our 31st president, as we come to you from West Branch, Iowa, and get a call from Longmont, Colorado. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm a former Iowan, and I was in that crowd in '62 at the dedication of the birthplace. But as a former high school counselor,
Well, let me go back to that. What do you remember about that? It was August 10th, 1962.
That's right.
What do you remember about that day?
I took down the date to put in my autobiography. Since I'm 80, that's what I'm writing now. Well, I remember it was warm, and I was very pleased to be able to see a president. And since then, I visited many of the presidential libraries.
And in fact, you saw two presidents that day, did you not?
Yes, yes. But I don't remember Truman.
Do you remember what Herbert Hoover said?
Not really, but it was inspirational is all that I really remember about it. What I'm interested in is that his background of work overseas and in Australia and China. As a former high school counselor, I think that was tremendous at that time of our history, and I particularly think that we should consider him as a citizen of the world now. What does the author think of that?
I think that's a very, very good way to put it. He really was. He was certainly the most cosmopolitan man to be president of the 20th century. I think only Jefferson would rival him. And of course, Jefferson didn't have the opportunity to travel the world to the extent that Hoover did. And yet Hoover said that every homecoming for him was a reaffirmation of the greatness of America.
North Mankato, Minnesota is next for Richard Norton Smith, former director here at the Hoover Library. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Thank you. You have a very interesting series. I've caught every one. I have a couple questions. Perhaps Mr. Smith could answer these, or somebody else at the Library Museum that my family and self have visited a number of times. About 20 years ago, there was a mini-series on television called Backstairs at the White House. It was based on a book by Lillian Rogers Parks, who was a worker at the White House and who wrote on some of her experiences with some of the presidents there. In the miniseries, Larry Gates played President Hoover and Jan Sterling played Lou Hoover. In the book, and also in the series, it mentions an incident that occurred sometime in 1931-32, where there was an intruder that came into the state dining room during a formal luncheon and threatened the president. After this event, the president was rushed upstairs, and the staff more or less ran into hiding, and they established a series of bells and whistles for them to use every time the president or one of his party was coming out to disappear. Also, I want to comment on Lou Henry Hoover's use of gestures for when one of the staff was supposed to leave the area or during speaking engagements with her. And also I wonder if you could comment, or if anybody is aware that Mr. Hoover, I believe, is the only president that had audience with Adolf Hitler in 1938 when he was in Berlin.
A number of points there. Thank you for the call. We talked about the Hitler meeting earlier.
I think generally it's true to say that the series was very entertaining. I remember I saw it myself. It was very entertaining, and it, so we say, somewhat exaggerated. For instance, Mrs. Hoover's use of the mannerisms. Very interesting thing, though. The Hoovers, as long as they lived, whenever at dinner or wherever else they wanted to speak and not be understood, they would always communicate in Chinese. It was something that they had picked up when they were living in China right after their wedding. The particular incident that you referred to in 31, I'm not familiar with. I'm not questioning it. Those were indeed bleak times, dangerous times. It's entirely possible. There was, in fact, a series of bells and whistles, as you say, that was installed to let people know. And I think there's some variation of that even today in the White House. There is one incident that you might be interested in involving Mrs. Hoover. In 1929, she unwittingly touched off a national uproar by being the first lady to invite a black woman socially as her guest at the White House. She was the wife of a congressman from Chicago. And believe it or not, this touched off an uproar, particularly in the segregated South. The Texas legislature went so far as to demand the president's impeachment. Mrs. Hoover apologized to her husband, who, by the way, had already invited on his own the president of Tuskegee Institute to dine with him, emulating TR's invitation to Booker T. Washington. Anyway, Mr. Hoover said to Lou, "Don't worry, Lou, you did the right thing. And besides, one of the consolations of Orthodox religion is that it provides a hot hell for the Texas legislature."
Since we're on the subject of the former First Lady who passed away 12 years after leaving the White House, this was from 1932 while she was still in the White House with birthday greetings to the 4-H Club.
Boys and girls of the 4-H Club, a happy birthday to you. A happy birthday to the 4-H Club this week, and to each and every one of you individually, sometime during the year to come. I like birthdays. It not only gives one's friends an opportunity of congratulations for the past and good wishes for the future year, but it gives the birthdayer himself a cause for pause and thought over what he has managed to accomplish in the past and what he aspires to in the future.
Lou Hoover, we owe Lou a lot. She was a great student of White House history, and during her time there, she undertook a project to document the history of the house, which was very poorly documented before, and in fact had all the furnishings documented, photographed, and wrote a history of the White House, which has never been published. And it came in very handy when Jacqueline Kennedy undertook her restoration of the White House some 30 years later.
In your book, and we're going to show our audience the sense of Herbert Hoover in the White House the same year, 1932, when he was running for re-election. On page 129, you write, "At the heart of the problem with Herbert Hoover in the White House was his own inability to fill the role of presidential persuader or to play the political games his opponents dominated by default." Let's look at this clip from 1932, filmed from the White House, and come back with Richard Norton Smith.
Mr. President, this is one of the happy occasions when the Republican Party officially comes together, and we've had a wonderful time, and I am able to make a splendid report as to our appreciation of what you've done in the White House, and we're going to keep you there.
Senator, I scarcely know whether to thank you for any such suggestion or not, but I do appreciate the character of the meeting which the party has had. It has shown a complete harmony to the American people.
Richard Norton Smith, what was the Republican Party like in 1932?
Desperate, divided, probably resigned to defeat. Prohibition divided the Republican Party in a way that it didn't the Democrats. It was a defeatist organization to the point where some people wanted to try and draft Calvin Coolidge, who, of course, had left office 4 years earlier, absolutely refused to consider that. Hoover was very much alone. The Republican organization had weakened considerably during his presidency. He really hadn't paid much attention to it. He was not much of a party politician. Whenever children, in later years always wrote him letters asking him about his career as a politician, he would go out of his way to replace the word politician with public servant. Part of him never was comfortable with the notion of party politics.
Grand Forks, North Dakota, you're next.
I'm very much looking forward to reading your book. This is, of course, a very speculative question, but what kind of a war president would Hoover have made? Would he have supported a defense buildup as FDR did prior to the outbreak of war?
That's a very good question, and All I can say is that he worked very closely. He was, in effect, a member of Woodrow Wilson's war cabinet. Certainly really took the lead in putting the country on a war footing. Now, to be sure, that was a domestic approach. He did reduce the size of the armed forces as president. He undertook, along with British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, an international disarmament conference, in particular a reduction of naval armaments. So there's no doubt about it that Hoover, true to his Quaker faith, when he was in office, certainly, you could argue, starved the military. Now, he also, as you undoubtedly know, was not eager to see the United States get into World War II. Really didn't come out fully in support of the effort until after the Japanese attack. So, I don't know. You know, in wartime, as opposed to the buildup before the war, I think those are two different questions.
Virginia Beach, Virginia, as we look at President Herbert Hoover. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. The first thing I would like to mention is that originally I'm from West Branch. Left about 15 years ago, and some of my fondest childhood memories actually take place right there in Hoover Park. And to show what kind of a small world it actually truly is, rumor has it that Mr. Norton actually bought and lived for some time the house that I was born and raised in up on 5th Street.
Well, indeed. It's a wonderful house. It's a wonderful neighborhood.
Absolutely, those big old maple line 5th Street. But in
particular, we'll come back to you. Mentioned Hoover Park, and if we can, we'll try to give you a better vista of this whole area around us. It encompasses how many acres of land?
Well, actually, now the National Park Service operates the site. It's over 170 acres, including a 75-acre restored prairie, which gives you a sense of what Iowa looked like in the 1870s, plus some of the buildings that we've seen today, the oval behind the library in front of the grave site. So it's a very large area, and I can imagine it'd be a great place for kids to play.
And the architect for the library, who designed it?
Was an Iowa City architect for the original building, which again, as I say, was a fraction of what you see there today. When I was here, we added about 12,000 feet onto the building and redid the entire museum exhibit.
We'll go back to you in Virginia Beach, caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. My question is, as you walk in the main entrance of the library and you look immediately to your left, there used to be a room called the China Room, and I was wondering if the presidential suite actually took the place of the old China Room in later years.
We're sitting in it. And in fact, but recalling the China Room, we have on display here in this recreation of the Waldorf Suite, as it was in Mr. Hoover's day, some of the famous blue and whites, the Chinese porcelains that he and Mrs. Hoover began collecting really on their honeymoon in China. And when Mrs. Hoover died in 1944, the president went on collecting really in tribute to her. And by the time of his death, the collection numbered about 400 pieces. These are absolutely gorgeous 16th, 17th century Chinese porcelains, priceless as you might imagine. Today, I suspect they probably picked up some of them for a song 100 years ago. And the library retains, of those 400, about 66 in its permanent collection. Some of them are on display here in 31A.
And behind me, one of the...
The Tommyknocker.
The Tommyknocker.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, Mr. Hoover, before World War I, had offices in New York, Paris, London, San Francisco, and St. Petersburg, Russia. And in fact, he had about 170,000 people working for him in his Russian enterprises. And that is a Russian Tommyknocker, which is, in fact, to be found, placed by miners below the ground. It's supposed to ward off evil spirits.
In this room, Suite 31A, the Waldorf Astoria, he lived in how long?
Over 20 years.
Terrebonne, Oregon, you're next for Richard Norton Smith.
Yes, hello. Appreciate the program. My first memory of politics was when Herbert Hoover was defeated. Roosevelt was elected, and I was in the second grade. And I lived in Oregon and didn't realize that Herbert Hoover's background in Oregon. But then later, I did go to Stanford and reserve program in 1943 and was at Encino Hall, and again did not realize that Hoover had been there, President Hoover. My question is, it's been referred to his football managership, and I had heard while in high school that he had organized or helped organize or managed the first football team at Stanford, and it was referred to in your program that in the late 1890s he was a manager, and I was wondering if you know whether that was one of Stanford's first teams.
It was, and in fact, Hoover really distinguished himself at Stanford less as a scholar and more as an entrepreneur. He started the Red Star Laundry. He also ran a lecture agency, which brought, among others, William Jennings Bryan to campus. So that was, he was also a class treasurer, and he managed to liquidate a debt of $2,000.
Princeton, New Jersey. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I have two questions, please. First of all, is it true that President Hoover did not accept any salary during his presidency? And then secondly, a couple of weeks ago on the program, a gentleman remarked that during the 20th century at least, that there were three presidents who were extremely learned, who had had more education, namely Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and President Hoover. Can you comment a bit more about President Hoover's education and how much of a scholar he might have been? Thank you very much.
Two good questions. Yes, he did not accept a salary, not only as president, he never accepted a salary during 50 years of public service. That included the commerce years, for example, when President Truman had to reorganize the federal government, and then again President Eisenhower. He never took a penny for any of those services. He said that this country had given him so much. What was the second question?
The salary. He was one of two presidents that did not accept
John F.
it.
Kennedy is the other president. The question about Hoover being learned. Hoover was a historian. He was a self-taught historian. He started the Hoover Institution really to preserve the documentary history of World War I. Most of his books, in fact, were documentary histories. He wrote a book called The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, which was a very sympathetic account of Wilson's problems at the Versailles Peace Conference. And so I guess you could say he was, in fact, a self-made scholar.
In this century, 4 or 5 Republican Party nominees had never held elective office before becoming the party nominee, Herbert Hoover being one of those. Why did the party select somebody like him who had never been elected before?
He was an unorthodox choice. The people forced him on the Republican Party. I mean, remember, World War I, the Belgian relief effort, the Food Administration, he was regarded as, a miracle worker. The Secretary of Commerce, he has burnished his credentials. And then, of course, the Mississippi flood in 1927. In those days, the federal government took no part in flood relief efforts. It was strictly a local effort. And Hoover rushed to the scene. He organized this effort almost overnight. And that really was the frosting on the cake of his reputation.
In 1928, at the Republican Party convention, Herbert Hoover said, quote, "We in America are nearer today to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." He went on to say that the poorhouse is vanishing from us. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. What happened just about a year later in October 1929?
When he said that, he spoke the consensus across the political spectrum. A year later, of course, in October of 1929, Wall Street crashed. And there was this persistent myth that the Depression began the next day, that Wall Street caused the Depression. A couple things to keep in mind. In 1929, 2.5% of the American people owned stock. That's compared to 42% today if you include mutual funds. So in fact, those who were directly affected by the stock market crash were very small. The Depression did not begin in 1929. There was a recession in 1930. And Hoover, it wasn't a do-nothing response. Hoover, in fact, was a very activist response. Hoover did not believe that boom and bust cycle was ordained. And to demonstrate that, he went into action. He he contacted all 48 governors. He brought together representatives of railroads, utilities, the auto industry, and he made them pledge, unlike in other busts, they would not lay off. They would not cut salaries. They would not begin this cycle of mass deflation, which everyone always believed was necessary to let nature take its course, work its way out of the excesses of a boom. And that jawboning, that covenant with the private sector held more or less for most of 1930. The best estimate is there were about 4 million people unemployed in 1930. In fact, to tell you how insignificant at that time the crash was regarded, the beginning of 1930, the New York Times listed the leading events of 1929. You know what the leading event was? It was Admiral Byrd's trip to the South Pole. This was just 2 months after the crash. The AFL praised Hoover's intervention. The New York Times said that no president had ever acted so boldly to interject himself into the economy. The Farm Board was already in action, trying to alleviate farm crisis. Then, of course, any number of factors contributed to a worsening of the situation. Who could have predicted the Dust Bowl? Talk about an act of God. You had mature industries. Americans had bought enormous numbers of radios and houses and automobiles, and basically they were bought out. There are many economists who will argue that the easy money policies that have been pursued by the Federal Reserve contributed to speculation. You had a rickety bank system that was a disaster waiting to happen. And finally, Hoover himself believed, until the day he died, that it was World War I and the dislocations caused by World War I that was the biggest single factor leading to the Depression. And you had this crazy Rube Goldberg system. Remember, the Germans had been hit with harsh reparations. The Germans were borrowing money to pay their reparations to France. They were borrowing the money from U.S. banks. We were loaning it to Germany to pay it to France, which then paid their reparations back to us, their war debts. It was a system that could not have been sustained, and once problems began cropping up with American banks, it became an international crisis.
Your book points out that in the 1920s, the term Hooverize was meant to conserve or to save
That's right.
meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays. Yeah. And then in the early 1930s, we see Hoover tents and Hoovervilles.
Yes, exactly. The great paradox of Herbert Hoover's life is that he went into office the most, not only admired, arguably the most beloved figure in the world, the man who fed Europe. And he rode to the last campaign rally of his 1932 campaign past crowds of New Yorkers chanting, "We want bread." Somewhere within that paradox is the tragedy of Hoover. Hoover, in some ways, Hoover was also the victim of modern publicity. Remember, the advertising industry had come of age in the 1920s. Hoover hadn't minded tapping into it in terms of the Food Administration exhorting Americans voluntarily to go without so that we could help our allies in Europe. He, in a sense, became a victim of that tendency to personalize and dramatize events that I think an earlier generation would have looked at as being beyond the control of any one individual.
We're looking at the life and presidency of Herbert Hoover, who was born in 1874, died in 1964 in New York. He lived until he was 90 years old. We'll get a call from Bellport, New York. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. This is Reverend Ken Stanley. I live in Yaphank and Bellport, Long Island. Quite interested in the program. Good morning, Mr. Scully and Mr. Smith. What I'd like to know is, well, in the upcoming New Hampshire primaries, my uncle and I are both going to be on the ballot, probably one of 20. And people should know that they can pay $1,000 to get on the ballot. I'm interested to know, I didn't know that Nixon was a distant cousin of Mr. Hoover. And what I'd like to know, number one, what was his greatest triumph? And number two, was there ever a scandal in his administration?
Thanks for the call.
Interesting question. The greatest triumph in Hoover's life, I think, was his humanitarian work. Some might argue on a personal level his greatest triumph was the comeback that he made after the presidency.
When was he the happiest?
Oh, gosh. In terms of public service, the 20s at the Commerce Department. He loved it because it was this wonderful opportunity to put into practice a lot of these theories. Commerce under Hoover, before Hoover, Commerce had been the sleepiest department in the government. No one had paid any attention to it. He remade it. He created the Federal Radio Commission. The first airport in Washington, D.C. was called Hoover Field. He took a great interest in aviation, transformed the Census Bureau to become a treasure trove of information for business planners, undertook product standardization, Hoover Dam, and on and on and on. He was a whirlwind, really, and he was very happy in those days, professionally and personally. The other half of the question was scandal. No, and in fact, interestingly enough, one of the things that Hoover really resented about the New Deal was the fact that they tried very hard to find scandal in the Hoover presidency, and no one really ever found any.
Sacramento is next. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for taking my call. First-time caller. I'd like to ask Mr. Smith a question. I am an amateur collector of books dealing with that Great Depression period. I came across a book recently called The Poverty of Abundance, called Hoover, the Nation, the Depression, by a man named Albert Ramasco.
Yeah.
And it seems to deal fairly with the period that Hoover was in. Do you have any comment about that author and his book?
Yeah, I regard that book very highly as well. I think it is a very fair attempt to understand Hoover within the context of his times. You know, so often we tend to read back into history, and yet, of course, history is lived forward. I'll give you one statistic that when people criticize Hoover for not doing more, for not putting the full resources of the federal government behind a depression fighting program, do you have any idea what percentage of the GNP the federal government actually occupied in 1929? Today it's over 20%. 1929 it was 3%. So it was a rather dull weapon that he had at his command. I will recommend a more recent book, which I think is absolutely first-rate. It's David Kennedy's book, Freedom from Fear, which is a comprehensive history of the United States in the Depression and World War II. And it is really the first book I've ever read that I think goes back to basics and wipes the slate clean and looks at Hoover and Roosevelt in a very fair, objective, empathetic way.
Speaking of books, with a new book out looking at the Reagan presidency and his life 10 years after he left the White House, what's a good time frame for historians to look at a president and put his life into some sort of perspective?
That's a good question. It's sped up in some ways. Everything about life is sped up, including our cycles of historical interpretation. You know, when Ronald Reagan left office, he was very popular with the American people. He was never very popular with the intelligentsia. And he sort of went through a period there of substantial criticism, particularly from the left. But Reagan revisionism was in full swing even before the Morris book appeared. When Hoover died in 1964, his papers here did not begin to be available until '66. So the real research, the original research that allowed people for the first time to get behind the scenes, took place in the late '60s, early '70s, even early '80s, by which time he'd been out of office 40 years. Harry Truman left office in 1953, died 20 years later, and it's really only since then that Truman, the popular hero, has taken over. So it's 20, 30 years. Richard Nixon used to say that no one would really begin to write objectively about him for 50 years after his death.
Enid, Oklahoma is next.
Hello. I would like to mention that Herbert Hoover had some experiences here in Oklahoma when he was growing up. I think he was 13 when he came to live with an uncle. This uncle was the agent at the Osage Indian Agency in Pawhuska, Pawhuska, Oklahoma. I was born in 1922, and when I was around 10 years of age, his running mate, Senator Charles Curtis Kansas, who was a member of the Osage tribe, came to Pawhuska to make an appearance. I can recall standing on the street in Pawhuska to watch him drive by all by himself, well, with one or two other people, in one of those high cars that political figures used to ride in. There were hardly any people on the streets. I'm sorry to say, though I'm a Democrat.
What year was this again?
And he very bravely put in his appearance, waving a high silk hat and making 2 circles through.
What was the year again, caller?
Street. What did you say?
What year again did that take place?
I'm not positive, but I think it was sometime around the campaign in 1932.
Richard Norton Smith?
Yeah, in fact, Hoover, as a matter of fact, you're quite right. Charles Curtis is kind of an odd figure. His nickname was Egg Curtis because he had this shtick. He would go out to the back of the train and he would hold up eggs and he would denounce the price of eggs as a sign of inflation, and that was about the most memorable thing he did. He's not regarded as one of our finer vice presidents. Hoover was indeed affected by his time in Oklahoma. One of the things he did as president before the crash, he thought that we had mistreated the Indians badly, and he reorganized the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that along with prison reform and an antitrust division in the Justice Department were 3 of the kinds of progressive reforms that he was actually able to undertake before the crash.
As part of the library and museum here in West Branch, Iowa, is the Hoover Archive. Tim Walsh is rejoining us from that part of the library. What can people who visit the archives learn and see?
Steve, there's all kinds of documents and memorabilia here. We have over 8.5 million pages of documents, about 3.5 million of which are Mr. Hoover's. And we have an assortment of documents here for you to see. For the most part, people come to the archives part of the building to do research, and we have students as young as the 5th grade, but of course going up to postdoctoral scholars. On the podium here, I have a copy, in fact the reading copy of Herbert Hoover's inaugural address. And what's interesting about it is he raises many of the same issues in that document that presidents raise today: crime control and poverty, public health, education. In many ways, if you read his inaugural address, you see the hope that he had for the nation. What's also interesting about the specific document is that there are little stains on it, and it's not tear stains but actually water droplets, because during the time he was reading the inaugural address it was raining, and so the reading copy shows the effects of that particular rain.
Tim Walsh, let me stop you there and ask Richard Norton Smith, and I think we have some film of this from March of 1929 when he was sworn into office succeeding Calvin Coolidge. What was the country like then?
Oh, I think complacent. I think it was difficult for Hoover, much as it would be problematic, say, for George Bush, taking over from a very popular 2-term president. It's very difficult for a president succeeding someone of his own party to put his own stamp on the inauguration. Time allows you to do that with your administration, but it's a somewhat awkward transfer of power. And Hoover's relationship with Coolidge was not warm. Coolidge once said, "That man has given me advice for 6 years, all of it bad," and they were not particularly close. So Hoover, in some ways, was almost straitjacketed by how reformist he could be in his inaugural address, lest it be taken as an implicit repudiation of his predecessor.
And this was on the east front of the U.S. Capitol. It moved to the west front when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in 1981. When did they
first inauguration broadcast on radio? And that, of course, is that's William Howard Taft, former President Taft, administering the oath of office as Chief Justice.
See the Library of Congress directly in the background. When did they change the inauguration from March to January 20th?
It was during the Roosevelt presidency, I believe 1937. And in part because that interregnum was so horrible between Hoover and Roosevelt that dragged on and on and on. When you had a repudiated president at the beginning of November and an incoming president at the beginning of March, and it was decided that that was just too long. And so that period was shortened, and we went to the January 20th inauguration date.
And as you look, you can see some of the blimps in the air over the Capitol. There's a New Yorker cover magazine with Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. What does that tell you about the relationship between those two men?
Well, it says volumes. It's a classic case of a picture worth more than 10,000 words. There is a myth. One of the myths about that day, in fact, is that they spoke not at all, that Hoover sat glum and unsmiling. In fact, there is footage of, I mean, he was a gentleman, and he was going to go through this as painful as it might be, and that's been documented. But the classic image is of Roosevelt trying almost desperately and unsuccessfully to get Hoover to respond to anything he said during what must have been one of the longest one-mile rides in American history.
16 blocks from the White House to the U.S. Capitol. Tim Walsh, what else is in the archives?
Well, it's interesting that we talk about the relationship between Hoover and Roosevelt, because our next document is the journal of the banking crisis that took place in February and early March of 1933. In fact, Mr. Hoover was so frustrated with dealing with Mr. Roosevelt, trying to come up with a coordinated plan of action on dealing with this banking crisis in which one bank after another was closing, that he sat down every day and wrote out and then had typed up a journal of what went on. He wanted to leave a documentary record. And so what we have here are the first 2 pages, the summary that was typed up, and also then the first page, February 9th, 1933. That particular month, from February 9th or so until March 4th, was a month of great crisis in our country, and that frustration in not getting Roosevelt to be able to cooperate with him in a concerted effort to relieve the panic, to bring confidence to the nation, because of course Hoover wasn't going to be president on March 4th. Roosevelt said, well, there'll be time enough after March 4th to do something, and I think the bitterness in Hoover's heart probably led to that very long ride that Richard talked about.
As we look at that, we'll get some more calls and come back to you, Tim Walsh, in the archives here at the library. Etna, California, you're next.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. I think it's the first time Etna has gotten in. I have a vague recollection as a little boy of 4 or 5 years old of going to the Civic Auditorium in San Francisco to see the first television pictures of Herbert Hoover's inauguration. As I recall, it was just a still picture, and it was very vague, but I'm not sure if that is a false memory or if there's some truth in it.
Richard Norton-Smith?
No, you're absolutely right. Actually, it's kind of curious. That first inaugural was delayed. It poured, and it must have been a forerunner of things to come. It was a dreary, dismal day. And Mrs. Hoover and Mrs. Coolidge, who were much closer than their husbands were, they were very, very dear friends, actually got lost in the bowels of the Capitol building. And they thought it was hilarious that they were holding up the inauguration. But they eventually found their way to the platform, and there you see, it's a very wet day. Didn't dampen the enthusiasm of the crowds, but in some ways it does sort of foreshadow a rather dismal 4 years.
You mentioned first inauguration on radio.
Right.
We saw a number of film cameras in the background of
Yes.
that footage. When did television start coming about? And what was Herbert Hoover's role in that?
Yeah. Well, ironically, it's interesting because Herbert Hoover is the first person in history whose image was transmitted by television. He was Secretary of Commerce. This was in the spring of 1927. And AT&T had hooked up this public demonstration of this new device, which was not called television at the time. And he was in Washington, and his flickering image was transmitted to New York. And that is, we in fact have here in the museum, we have the original television, which is a great ungainly contraption, as you might imagine. He was very active in the regulation of radio. Amy Semple McPherson, the evangelist, sent him a telegram telling him that he must keep his minions of Satan off her frequency, because when she was broadcasting, she had to speak directly to and for God. Another group came to him wanting a radio frequency. In those days, you went to the federal government, directly to the Secretary of Commerce for radio frequency, to broadcast their belief that the world was about to end in a month. And he turned them down. He said, if the world's going to end in a month, you can spend your money better.
Did Herbert Hoover ever address the nation on radio?
He did. He did a number of occasions during his presidency, and in fact a number of appeals during the Depression in particular, appeals for citizen generosity, for fundraising, for various community chests and the like.
Orangeburg, South Carolina, you're next.
Good morning. Wonderful series. I have a little joke. I'm an old fellow with a pretty good memory, and I'm drawing on my memory, and then I'd like to ask a question. When they named the great engineering achievement the Hoover Dam, and then Roosevelt came in and changed it to the Boulder Dam, and then Eisenhower came in a couple of decades later and changed it back to Hoover, a young David Brinkley made a joke that this could all be settled if Herbert Hoover would just change his name to Herbert Boulder. But to my question, as I recall it, the Roosevelt early years entailed the retention of a professional public relations man named, as I think, recalling it, Charlie Watson, who was a tall, white-haired man whose total job was to blacken the name of Herbert Hoover, to blame everything that happened in the first year or two of the Roosevelt administration, if it could be possibly twisted, that this was somehow due to the nefarious administration of Herbert Hoover. Am I correct in that memory?
You are partially correct, sir. The gentleman's name was Charlie Michelson, and he was in fact hired not by the Roosevelt administration. Originally, he was hired by the Democratic National Committee, whose chairman was a man named John J. Rascom, former General Motors chairman, and as I say, far to the right of Hoover. But they hired Michelson, who was a genius at vituperation. And genius that he was, he really initiated a cottage industry that was aimed at blackening Hoover's name, as you point out. It was pretty rough for Hoover, although, to his credit, before he died, he'd actually developed a sense of humor about the whole thing. He once said, "I'm the only man of such surpassing economic genius as to have a worldwide depression named after me." And one of these blue and whites, he had a devil on it, and he named it Charlie. And that was his tongue-in-cheek tribute to the man who had done so much to link his name to the Great Depression.
Tim Walsh, let me go through a couple of items rather quickly. First of all, what was Hoover Ball?
Hoover Ball was a game that was invented by Joel Boone, the White House physician, who said, you know, Mr. Hoover, you're spending too much time at a desk, you're gaining weight, you've got to lose some weight. And so this is one of the original Hoover Balls signed by the members of his Hoover Ball cabinet, or medicine ball cabinet it was called, 18 regulars, average age 53 years. They would play every morning on the White House lawn from 7 to 7:30. It's a game played, it's a combination of medicine ball, volleyball, and tennis, scored like tennis. Mr. Hoover said it had required less skill than golf, but was far more vigorous.
Was he an athletic man?
Well, he was a man who realized the value of physical fitness and physical exercise, but I think other than fishing, the physical exercise that he got in the White House was confined to this daily regimen of Hoover Ball. And then after the Hoover Ball match was over each morning, the cabinet, which consisted of cabinet members and Supreme Court justices, would meet for coffee and talk over the issues of the day. So it was a kind of the early stages of networking, we might say.
I'm not sure if you have it there handy, but Richard Norton Smith was talking about the bank crisis in February and March of 1933, the final weeks of the Hoover presidency. What was that like for him, and what does his journal that I think you have nearby tell you about what Herbert Hoover was thinking?
Well, it tells you specifically, Steve, about the frustration that we have. I'm going to put it back up on the easel here. I suppose for a man as active and as involved in life and in public affairs as Herbert Hoover, that month must have been tremendously frustrating, because the Congress, which as Richard suggested was to the right of Herbert Hoover, would do nothing because they knew Roosevelt was going to be president. Roosevelt, in turn, wouldn't reveal what his plans were. So here's Hoover in the White House trying to do something to remedy the problems of the nation, but unable to do so. There's a wonderful quote in the diary of Ted Joslin, his press secretary, and Joslin comes to him toward the end, I think it's March 3rd, and says, "Mr. President, is there anything more that we can do?" And Mr. Hoover says, "No, Ted, we're at the end of our string." Really kind of a very sad moment for a man who was the great engineer, the master of emergencies, facing this emergency, but unable to get the support he needed to get the job done.
Richard Norton Smith, two engineers serving in the White House, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, both one-term presidents, both followed more popular presidents, Roosevelt serving 3 full terms and a couple of weeks into his 4th term, Ronald Reagan 2 full terms. Is there a fair comparison between the two men?
You know, comparisons are dangerous, but I think there are some broad similarities. Both are humanitarians more than they are politicians. Both have had long, very active, very distinguished careers out of office, which have only served to contrast those personal qualities. I think there are some parallels, yeah.
One last item from the archive with Tim Walsh, and that is the chair used in the Oval Office.
Here it is, Steve. This is the chair that Mr. Hoover sat in for up to 18 hours a day, and you can see it's badly worn. The arms are badly worn away, and even most of the kind of clamshell pattern is worn away on the seat and the back. Mr. Hoover, you know, the criticism is that he didn't do anything during the Depression. To the contrary, he was managing almost beyond human proportions. This is the only piece that we have from Mr. Hoover's Oval Office. If people are interested in the Oval Office as it appeared during the Hoover administration, they'll have to go to the Roosevelt Library, because most of the furnishings stayed there and in fact were used by Mr. Roosevelt. This same pattern appears on the chairs that appear in the Roosevelt Oval Office.
And we will be there next as we continue our American President series. Tim Walsh, thank you, and thank you for your staff for opening up the doors here at the Hoover Library and Museum and allowing C-SPAN to share with our audience the life and times of Herbert Hoover.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Richard Norton-Smith, before we go back to calls, what would be a typical day in the Hoover presidency?
It was very long. I mean, he started very early. He started with Hoover ball, which, by the way, like an engineer, you know why he played Hoover ball. He was told by experts that it would give him 3 times as much exercise as tennis and 6 times as much as golf. And that's how he approached life and he approached work. He had round-the-clock meetings. He once said at the end of a long, despairing day, he said, I met with a dozen people today and no one had a new idea. And I think as the Depression went on and it proved increasingly intransigent, it was terribly frustrating. He would wolf down meals. He ate a 5-course state dinner in 11 minutes once because he was desperately anxious to get back to his desk. He was angry when he had to go over to Alexandria, Virginia, and dedicate the George Washington Masonic Memorial because he had to leave the more important business of trying to tend to the Depression. He did get away. He did not see his home in California during the 4 years that he was president, but he did create a fishing camp with his own money out in the mountains in Virginia, down along today the Skyline Drive. And that was his one escape. He would go out there, and even there, he would spend 12 hours a day on the phone. A long-distance phone was installed, trying to, in some cases, prop up specific banks that were on the verge of crashing. That's where, for example, the European reparations crisis arose. In 1931, remember, we had these enormous wartime reparations that were weighing down the European economies, and Hoover did something rather radical. He proposed a 1-year moratorium on all international war reparation payments. And it was one of the few instances where he was almost universally applauded for taking bold action. Well, that was something that he had finalized out there in the woods, what he called Camp Rapidan.
Did he read a lot?
He did. He read constantly. It was pretty depressing what he was reading, but he did. He read, and he said one of the nice things about being president is that you can decide when to leave the room and when to go to bed. And he said, I go to bed at 10 o'clock because I'm up at 6 and I read in bed.
He's also the author of 40 books. We'll get a call from Columbus, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Wonderful series. Thank you for letting me call. I wanted to make a comment relative to a question I'd like to ask. It's my understanding that Mr. Hoover didn't live in the Waldorf Astoria, but rather the Waldorf Towers, a luxurious quasi-residential facility associated with the hotel. And in fact, there's a plaque commemorating his residency there. There is also a plaque commemorating the residency of Douglas MacArthur. And I wondered if they had any interesting elevator rides in the 1950s and perhaps what his response to MacArthur in those days might have been. And also in the 30s when he lived there, I believe Lucky Luciano lived there as well. And so I'm curious about any comments you might have about Mr. Hoover's neighbors. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Anybody who lived there. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor spent time every year at the Waldorf Towers, and you are quite right. It's an adjunct to the main Waldorf Astoria. Elsa Maxwell, the great party giver, and indeed Douglas MacArthur was there. MacArthur was not very social, and in fact, Hoover couldn't abide eating alone. He always had to have people around him, and MacArthur was very different. And whenever the Hoovers visited with the MacArthurs, they always went to the MacArthurs. It wasn't the other way around. Hoover once said, not long before he died, that he couldn't understand why Mac, as he put it, was so inactive. He said he's a younger man than I. Well, he was born in 1884 instead of 1880.
Did Herbert Hoover try to get his party nomination again in 1936 or 1940?
He did. He sought vindication, the ultimate vindication. He tried in both 1936 and in 1940. It clearly was not in the cards. I mean, he was, for many Republicans, the ultimate tar baby at that point. The last person they wanted out there making the case for their party was Herbert Hoover. Ironically, FDR respected Hoover as the man who intellectually was the strongest opponent that might have been put up against him.
How many children did the Hoovers have?
They had 2 children, very private. Although Herbert Jr., who was something of a venture capitalist before the term came into use, did serve as Undersecretary of State during the Eisenhower administration under Christian Herter. Allen went into mining. I had ranching activity out in California. He was very close to his dad, and particularly in the last years, he was very close to his father.
And one of those descendants is Margaret Hoover Brigham, better known as Peggy. She's joining us from Westchester, Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning.
What do you remember of your grandfather?
Oh, a lot. I've been listening to the various comments, and I can give you aspects from when I was a little girl, and also when I was in college, and I would come down to New York for the weekend, and I would be slated as his hostess, which was very difficult because, as Richard said, he ate very fast, and having been president, protocol had him served first. And he would pick up his fork and start to work. And I would have to sit there and judge just about what time during the meal that I would pick up my fork so everybody else would have a chance to eat, because he usually was through. As you said, he ate very quickly. He was usually through before some of them had been served. It was amusing.
How old were you when he was in the White House?
I was 2 to 6, and I spent the winter of when I was 5 in the White House because my father was recovering from an illness, and so we were in the White House, and I have a lot of children memories from that time. Among them, the Easter egg hunt, which was appalling as far as I was concerned, because my usual playground was the south lawn of the White House. In those days, there was not a driveway through. And with the Easter eggs being rolled and crushed and then the sun beaming down, the next day, it was something for someone who was not quite 3 feet tall to have all that odorous rotting eggs in my playground. I was quite miffed. I can do remember that still.
Richard Norton Smith, one of the displays here in the library in the museum, talks about how Hoover's aides tried to use his grandchildren to personalize Herbert Hoover. Why was he reluctant to do that?
Well, he wouldn't use his family. He was not, he once said, "You can't make a Teddy Roosevelt out of me." Ironically, because he admired TR enormously. There's a wonderful story that illustrates this, and why he was the absolute nightmare of any kind of modern handler or PR whiz. There was a group of children, 3 I believe, who somehow in 1932 managed to hike from Detroit to Washington. Their father had been arrested supposedly on an auto theft charge, and they got to the White House and somehow managed to get into the White House. And Hoover said, if there are 3 children resourceful enough to get from Detroit to see me, they're going to see me. And he brought them into the president's office, and he said, tell me the story, and they explained what had happened, and the father was innocent, and anyway, he was clearly shaken by this, and he assured them that he would take care of it. He took keepsakes out of his desk and gave to each of them. He contacted the Justice Department personally, said, get that father out of jail. The equivalent of his press secretary thought, thank God, we finally got this wonderful humanizing story that will show to the American people what a compassionate president they have. Hoover absolutely refused for it to be made public, much less to have the children exploited. And there's great integrity in that, but it also illustrates why he was such a difficult candidate to market.
Peggy Brigham, what's your fondest memory of your grandfather as you got older?
I think one of the ones I remember, again, on the trips back down to the Waldorf Towers, was waking up at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and wide awake. So I would pad on into the living room, and there my grandfather would be sitting at his desk in his bathrobe, working away on his papers. And we'd nod to each other, and I'd sit down on the floor and play solitaire. We could spend hours together and not have to say a word. We were very comfortable with each other.
When was this picture taken that's on the screen right now?
No, I do not have the screen, so you'll have to tell me.
Actually, I think, Peggy, this is in 1932 when you accompanied your grandparents to Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, as part of the George Washington Bicentennial
Yes, I
celebration.
remember that. I can remember sitting next to my grandmother inside the church and having been told to be very quiet and not wiggle. And sitting next to her, I suddenly realized that her hand, she was twiddling her thumbs very quietly in her lap. So I twiddled my thumbs very quietly in my lap until the service was over.
Who was your father?
Herbert Hoover, Jr.
And again, Peggy, he went into public service fairly late in life, didn't he? I mean, with the
oil research and investigation and hunting, geophysics. He was a mining engineer himself, and he had been writing, first of all, the oil laws for Venezuela, and then he was asked to help Iran in their problems and trying to iron out the oil laws, concluding the Dutch shell and etc. And it was from that experience that he was asked to be Undersecretary of State.
Peggy Brigham, before we let you go, did the death of your grandmother in 1944 change your grandfather for the last 20 years of his life?
Not really, because he always wanted people around him, and he didn't go into a sad period. I think there was the only sad period that I can remember was right after his service in the White House, when he would play solitaire by the hour. And while he was doing that, he was doing a lot of thinking. He was just using his hands, keeping them busy while his mind was racing.
Peggy Brigham, who is the granddaughter of Herbert Hoover, our 31st president, joining us from Pennsylvania on the phone. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
We will continue with more of your phone calls. West Hills, California, for Richard Norton Smith. Go ahead, please. Hello, West Hills, California. Well, we don't have that call. Let me ask you about Camp Rapidon, because we have some pictures of it. How often did he get away from the White House?
He tried to get away as often as he could, and actually, 2 or 3 times a month. He loved the outdoors. He was a great conservationist, and he did. He loved fishing. He said that fishing was a great lesson in democracy because all men are created equal before fishes. He also criticized his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge, as a fundamentalist in economics and in fishing, which I take to mean that Coolidge fished with worms.
And he also went fishing with Dwight Eisenhower.
He did. He and Ike had kind of an arm's length relationship. Eisenhower was perhaps more willing to acquiesce in accepting much of the New Deal. And of course, Hoover had been close to Robert Taft, Eisenhower's conservative opponent. But Eisenhower asked Mr. Hoover to undertake a second Hoover Commission to further reorganize the executive branch of government. And they established a reasonably close relationship.
And again, Camp Rapidan before Camp David.
Before Camp David, that's right. In fact, FDR went there once. But for a man in a wheelchair, the terrain was just was really impassable.
Fremont, California is next.
Well, thank you for C-SPAN. And Mr. Smith, I have 2 questions for you. During in 1932, when Roosevelt was elected, I was under the impression that Roosevelt took his first 100-day plans a lot from President Hoover. Is this true? My second question is that in 1932, I believe the gold standard was $17 an ounce. Was it Roosevelt's idea to raise it to 32 or Hoover's? And I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of gossamer links between the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations, particularly during that first 100 days. People forget that one of the first things that Roosevelt called for was severe retrenchment in government spending. During the 1932 campaign, he had managed very deftly to run against Hoover from both the left and the right. And so it was sort of a hodgepodge, really, the first 100 days. The important thing was that it gave people a psychological boost. They felt that there was someone in a very activist way who was trying to address a whole host of problems. And Roosevelt was, and I don't mean this in any way in a denigrating way, he was a brilliant cheerleader at a time when the American people desperately needed to have their spirits raised. In the spring of 1933, the most popular song in America was a Disney tune called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? And psychologists attributed its popularity to public relief over Herbert Hoover's departure from office. Give you some idea of the mood of the time. As far as the gold standard goes, Hoover was desperate to stay on the gold standard. Roosevelt, of course, eventually took the country off the gold standard. But in the meantime, there was an interesting exercise that would take place every morning in President Roosevelt's bedroom at the White House. While he was in bed having his eggs and breakfast with the Secretary of the Treasury, every day they would set the price of gold. And one day he came up with the number 7, and someone said, why? And he said, well, I like the number 7. It's a lucky number. So it was a rather cavalier approach to economic management.
The Hoover Library characterizes the fishing expeditions of President Hoover, and later in life, as he retired from the White House in 1933. We'll show you that as we get a call from Falls Church, Virginia.
Hi. Great series. I just wondered if you could talk briefly about Mrs. Hoover. What kind of a woman was she, and what were her contributions as First Lady?
Well, it's a great question. Lou Hoover, in many ways, is a woman ahead of her time, and really is overshadowed by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was, by the way, for many years a good friend of hers. They were neighbors in Washington, and they shared many of the same concerns. And they both believed, by the way, very strongly that women should be very active in politics. Lou used to say that bad men get elected because good women don't vote. She was an intellectual. She spoke 5 languages. One thing we haven't talked about, an amazing thing they did, as I said, they spent 2 years of their lives on board ships during his mining career, traveling from country to country. And they didn't want to be bored. They wanted to do something intellectually challenging. So the two of them, although Lou did most of the work, they translated a 16th century Latin mining scholar, Agricola. And it's still regarded as a monument of mining scholarship. The book was published in a limited edition. If you have one of those, by the way, you have something very valuable indeed. In the 1920s, Lou organized her own conference after Teapot Dome to examine the whole question of law enforcement in Prohibition-era America. She was a very activist president of the Girl Scouts. Unfortunately, in the White House, she almost took the veil in some ways. It's still a mystery whether she would have been a more activist First Lady if the Depression had not come along and really rechanneled her energies overwhelmingly toward trying to support her husband. You can imagine what those days were like for both of them. And she tried to protect him as much as she could. Necessarily, that probably made her less active than she might have been otherwise.
We are in West Branch, Iowa, which is in the eastern part of the state, situated not too far from Iowa City and Cedar Rapids and Davenport, Iowa, as you can see on the screen. About a 2-hour drive along I-80 from Des Moines, 4 hours if you're in the Chicago area. West Branch, Iowa, about 265 people lived here when Herbert Hoover was born in 1874. Today, about 2,000. Has it changed much?
Oh, I don't think it's changed that much. There's still a very significant Quaker presence here. It's still a lovely small town. It's now sort of a bedroom community to Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is located. But also, it should be said that Park Service does a wonderful job of recreating the ambiance of what this town was like, down to the wooden sidewalks that young Bert Hoover would have walked as a boy.
So as you walk along here and as visitors travel to West Branch, what do they take away?
That's Main Street. That's the intersection. We used to talk about the Rush Minute when everyone went home from work. It's what you see is what you get, but it's a charming small town.
We'll show you more scenes around here as we get a call from Houston, Texas.
gentlemen. I'd like to open with kudos to Brian Lamb for C-SPAN, which I consider to be a national treasure. Mr. Smith, you mentioned a work in the opening of the program here that hasn't been published. Have you read this work?
I have read parts of it, and the fact is it went through very many drafts. This was something that Hoover worked on off and on, literally, for the last 30 years of his life, and it went through many incarnations. At one point it was called the War Book, then it was the Crucifixion of Liberty, and finally in its final finished form it was titled Freedom Betrayed.
I'm sure.
Go ahead, caller.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
I would greatly appreciate some kind of publication. Is there any chance this can be put on the net?
It hasn't been published yet, caller.
Yeah, it's never been published, but it's an interesting question. I'll talk to my colleagues and see whether they have any plans to do so. If nothing else, it's a great historical curiosity. And it's certainly something that Hoover devoted a great deal of his life to.
You point out in your book in the last 8 or 9 years of his life following the final Hoover Commission, he said a couple of things. First of all, that he would give no speech longer than 3 minutes in length, and he accepted a $25,000 a year presidential pension.
Well, what happened was his good friend Harry Truman went back to independence, all but broke. Mr. Truman needed the money. And there were no pensions for former presidents in those days. There was no Secret Service protection. And so Congress decided to establish a then $25,000 a year pension for former presidents. Hoover didn't want to publicly turn it down because he didn't want to embarrass his friend Mr. Truman, who needed the money a lot more than Hoover did. So what he did was he took the money and he used it in running his office, answering his mail. He always said, anyone who takes the trouble to send me a card, put a stamp on it, deserves a personal response. And he took that very seriously. In that 85th year that you mentioned, he answered personally 14,000 pieces of mail, many from children, which was one of the joys.
You also wrote that when he dedicated the library 2 years before his death, August 10th, 1962, he drove Harry Truman here to this site.
Well, yeah, it's funny. Again, it was a very, the ex-presidency was very different in those days. They had stayed up at the home of Howard Hall, who was a friend of Mr. Hoover's up in Cedar Rapids, Brucemore. You can visit it today. And they came down that morning, and unfortunately, nature called. And these are two old men, one in his late 80s and one almost 80, and they couldn't find a restroom. And they couldn't drive to the museum because it was about to be dedicated, and there were several thousand people outside. So they finally hit upon a stratagem. Mr. Truman someone said he would ruin his suit, and he said, well, if you don't find me a restroom soon, you'll have to buy me a new one. So they went to the Birthplace Cottage, and they broke in the window and the door of the caretaker's cottage next to the birthplace, and Mr. Truman found what he was looking for.
We'll get a call from Westport, Connecticut.
Hi.
Hello.
I think you may have answered my question. It regards some of the Hoover mythology. One was that there was a meeting as Truman was about to go home between him, the head of the DNC, an economist, and Mr. Hoover. Mr. Hoover had asked Harry how he was doing, that he always called him Harry, and Truman always called him Mr. President. And he said, I'm broke, sir. And that Hoover pulled out his checkbook and wrote out a check for $10,000. The other one was that Hoover and Truman were so close that that Truman phoned Hoover every week that he was in office.
No, it wasn't that close. And in fact, while Truman was in office, and of course particularly when he wanted to get reelected in 1948, he was not at all reluctant to use Hoover as a scapegoat, again, to personify the Great Depression. And Hoover resented it rather personally. He didn't understand how this man could be so friendly to him on a personal level and yet willing to exploit this public image that he had. And again, as I said earlier, Truman explained, oh, that's just politics. I would doubt very much whether Hoover personally ever loaned Truman money. But their friendship really blossomed actually after Truman left office.
As you mentioned, Herbert Hoover, one of the first people ever to be imaged on early television back in the 1920s. He appeared On October 29, 1956, on television again, endorsing Dwight Eisenhower for his re-election bid and talking about his own life.
I have lived a long life, and I have lived in many lands and under many kinds of governments, and I have worked under the governments of free men, of tyrannies, of socialists, and of communists. I was not a tourist. I was associated in their working lives and their problems. I had to deal with their social systems and their governments. I have had to deal with many princes and kings and despots and dictators, and I have worked with great spiritual leaders and great statesmen. The first half of my life was spent in a period of peace, when everywhere there was increasing freedom of men. The second half of my life I have been a constant witness to the malevolent forces of greed of men and nations, which brought us to a total war with its terrible aftermath and its no peace.
A look at Herbert Hoover in October 1956. Our next call is from Mankato, Minnesota. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I just have one brief comment, and then I'd like to ask a question. I'd just like to say that Herbert Hoover is probably one of the greatest people in history I'm aware of in terms of how many people he's helped and fed, and I just can't express my admiration for him, even though, you know, I said he's made a few mistakes, you know, with the tariffs. But my question is, sir, could you comment perhaps on some of the principal members of his cabinet and those that helped him during this administration? I'm particularly...
We're short on time. Key advisors, cabinet members?
Yeah, actually, one of the frustrations was how many people turned him down. You know, he wanted Charles Evans Hughes to be Secretary of State, turned him down. Dwight Morrow, who'd been a very distinguished diplomat in Mexico, turned him down. So Henry Stimson, who was an old friend of TR's, progressive Republican, distinguished choice, and of course perhaps better known as the man that Franklin Roosevelt made Secretary of War for World War II. Stimson was probably the largest figure. Andrew Mellon was Secretary of the Treasury, but Hoover got rid of him. He sent him to London because he thought Mellon was much too defeatist in his approach to the Depression, that Mellon really was a kind of do-nothing secretary, and he replaced him with Ogden Mills. It was not, by and large, considered a stellar cabinet.
Albuquerque, New Mexico, you're next.
Hi. I was wondering about, did Hoover attend the Quaker meetings in the White House during his presidency?
Good question. What he did actually, yes. In fact, he gave the money to build a new Quaker meeting house in Washington, which you can still visit and worship in. It's over near DuPont Circle.
The two Hoover commissions, the first came when?
The first came in 1946. And one of its prime members was Joseph B. Kennedy. And that's really the beginning of the close relationship between Hoover and the Kennedys. Ambassador Kennedy became very close to Hoover. One of Bobby Kennedy's first jobs was with the Hoover Commission. President Kennedy had nice things to say about Hoover, and in fact visited him here at the Waldorf as well. And in fact, when JFK became president, he asked Hoover to become honorary chairman of the Peace Corps.
Two final points. There is a letter on the wall here from your boss, Gerald Ford, as the director of the Ford Museum today. Why did he write to Herbert Hoover?
In 1964, in conjunction with Mr. Hoover's 90th birthday, he wrote to Hoover saying that he was not...
President's Life Portrait Series, we feature President Herbert Hoover. This program is about 2.5 hours.
I prefer to think of Iowa as I saw it through the eyes of a 10-year-old boy. Those were eyes filled with the wonders of Iowa's streams and woods. They saw days filled with adventure, with participation in good and comforting things.
Herbert Hoover carried fond memories of his Iowa childhood until the end of his 90 years. But all was not idyllic for the young future president, who was orphaned at age 9, and a year later sent to live with a Quaker uncle in Oregon. It was there that his already formidable self-reliance developed into a salient trait that would one day characterize his term in office.
My boyhood ambition was to be able to earn my own living, without the help of anybody, anywhere.
As a young adult, Hoover made extra money working in the onion fields near his home in Salem, Oregon. He attended business school at age 14, and 3 years later became the youngest member of Stanford University's Pioneer Class of 1891. At Stanford, he developed two interests, engineering and fellow geology student Lou Henry, whose natural intelligence and appetite for adventure matched his own. They married in 1899 and would have 2 boys. Hoover gave his wife plenty of adventure. They were still in their 20s when his career as a mining engineer took them around the world, to China during the Boxer Rebellion, to the gold mines of Australia, and to Burma, where a silver mine made him rich. By age 27, Hoover ranked as the highest paid man of his age in the world. Public service followed. During the First World War, Hoover helped raise billions of dollars to aid starving Europeans. He was named U.S. Food Administrator in 1917, and that same year joined President Wilson's War Trade Council. Such activities earned the shy and soft-spoken Hoover no small measure of celebrity. He was known as the Great Humanitarian and was soon singled out as a potential political candidate. In 1920, an assistant Navy secretary named Franklin Roosevelt remarked,
"He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him president. There couldn't be a better one."
Warren Harding made him his Commerce Secretary instead, a post Hoover